The stagecoach door swung open, and Margaret Hale's breath caught in her throat. The man she'd sent for, her mail-order husband, her last hope, stepped into the Dakota dust with chains still scarring his wrists. Prison. The word rippled through Silver Creek like wildfire. She'd advertised for help, not a convict. But as Eli Mercer's eyes met hers, honest, haunted, unafraid, something shifted. What crime had he committed, and why did his presence feel less like danger and more like salvation? Stay until the end, and comment your city below so I can see how far this story travels. The wind that swept through Silver Creek that October evening carried more than the scent of approaching winter. It carried rumors, half-truths, and the kind of judgment that could destroy a man before he ever spoke a word in his own defense. Margaret Hale stood on the warped planks of the stage depot platform, her worn shawl pulled tight against the chill, watching the Butterfield coach rumble down Main Street. Dust devils danced in its wake, obscuring the false-fronted buildings and the curious faces that had begun to gather. News traveled fast in a town of 300 souls, especially when that news involved a widow woman foolish enough to send for a stranger. She'd placed the advertisement 6 weeks ago, her hands trembling as she'd written the words. Widow with child seeks honest man for partnership. Farm, modest home, chance at decent life. Must be hardworking and kind. No drinkers. She hadn't mentioned that the farm was mortgaged to the hilt, that her late husband's debts had piled up like winter snow, or that her 7-year-old son Thomas hadn't smiled since they'd buried his father last spring. The coach lurched to a stop, and the driver, old Pete Hutchins with his tobacco-stained beard, climbed down with unusual haste. He wouldn't meet Margaret's eyes, and that was the first warning. The second was the way Reverend Michaels, who'd been walking past, suddenly crossed to the other side of the street. The door opened, and a man emerged. Eli Mercer was not what she'd expected. The letters they'd exchanged had been brief, practical. His penmanship better than she'd anticipated. His words careful but sincere. She'd imagined someone weathered by honest labor, perhaps middle-aged, perhaps plain. What stepped down from that coach was a man perhaps 35, tall and lean in a way that spoke of missed meals rather than natural build. His coat had seen better years, patched at the elbows with mismatched fabric. His hat was pulled low, but not low enough to hide the deep-set eyes that seemed to carry the weight of more than just a long journey. And there, just visible at his wrists as he reached for his battered canvas bag, were the telltale marks. Not fresh, but unmistakable. The abraded skin, the faint discoloration that came from iron cuffs worn too long. Margaret's heart dropped into her stomach. "Mrs. Hale?" His voice was low, carefully modulated, the accent hard to place. East of here, certainly, but filtered through years of somewhere else. She found she couldn't speak. Behind her, she heard Martha Yates gasp, and that gasp would be repeated in every parlor and shop before nightfall. "You're—" Margaret started, then stopped. What could she say? "You're not what I ordered?" As if a husband were a bolt of cloth that could be returned if the color wasn't right. "Eli Mercer, ma'am. I have your letters." He reached into his coat pocket, moving slowly, as if afraid sudden movements might startle her, or as if he'd learned that sudden movements brought consequences. "You didn't—" Her voice came out as a harsh whisper. She stepped closer, acutely aware of the audience they'd gathered. Pete Hutchins was already climbing back onto his coach, eager to be away. "You didn't mention you'd been in prison." Something flickered across Eli's face. Not anger, not shame exactly, resignation, perhaps. The look of a man who'd had this conversation before and knew how it ended. "You didn't ask, ma'am." He said it simply, without rancor. That's not something you hide." "No, ma'am. It's something people don't generally want to know about." He shifted his bag to his other hand. "I understand if you've changed your mind. I can take the next stage out. Won't be until Thursday, but I can work for my keep until then. Fix whatever needs fixing. No obligation." Margaret stared at him. His eyes never left hers, and in them she saw something that confused her anger. No pleading, no manipulation, just a bone-deep weariness and something else. Honesty. A terrible naked honesty that seemed to say, "This is what I am. I won't pretend otherwise." "What did you do?" The question came out before she could stop it. Mrs. Hale, Perhaps this conversation would be better conducted somewhere more private? Reverend Michaels had apparently overcome his reluctance and appeared at her elbow. His round face was flushed, his tone carrying all the authority of his position. "This man should not be here." Eli's expression didn't change, but Margaret saw his shoulders tighten almost imperceptibly. "Reverend, I appreciate your concern, but Martha Yates tells me this man arrived on the prison transport 2 months ago," the Reverend continued, pitching his voice to Carrie. "Spent 5 years in the territorial prison at Laramie." 5 years, Margaret. Whatever crime warrants such a sentence, I took a man's life." Eli's voice cut through the Reverend's speech like a blade through silk. The small crowd that had gathered went absolutely silent. "Shot him. Court found me guilty of manslaughter. Served my full sentence. I make no excuses for it." Margaret felt the blood drain from her face. She'd known it must be something serious, but hearing him say it so plainly with such brutal honesty. "You killed someone." Her voice sounded far away to her own ears. "Yes, ma'am." "And you thought, what, that I wouldn't mind? That I'd just accept a murderer into my home, around my son?" A muscle in Eli's jaw tightened. "Manslaughter, ma'am, not murder. And I thought you might be desperate enough to take a chance on a man trying to start over. Seems I was wrong." He tipped his hat. "My apologies for the trouble." He turned to leave, and Margaret felt the moment crystallizing around her. If she let him go, the town would never stop talking about how she'd almost brought a killer into their midst. They'd watch her, judge her, remind her constantly of her poor judgment. If she let him stay? Wait. The word surprised her as much as it did everyone else. Eli turned back slowly, his expression carefully neutral. Margaret's mind raced. She owed money to half the merchants in town. The winter wheat needed planting, and she couldn't work the plow herself. Thomas needed a man's influence, someone to teach him the things his father would have taught. She needed help, desperately, and help wasn't exactly lining up at her door. And something about the way Eli stood there, accepting judgment without fighting it, without making excuses or playing on her sympathy, struck something deep in her chest. She'd been lied to before. Her late husband, Garrett, had been a good man in many ways, but he'd lied about the debts, about the gambling, about the farm's prospects. She'd lived with pretty lies for 3 years. Maybe ugly truth was worth something. "Thursday's 4 days away," she heard herself saying. "You can stay in the barn until then. Work for your keep like you said. After that..." She took a breath. "After that, we'll see." Reverend Michaels made a sound of protest. "Margaret, you cannot possibly..." "It's Mrs. Hale's decision, Reverend," Eli said quietly, "and I'll abide by whatever she decides. Come Thursday." "This is unconscionable," the Reverend sputtered. "The church cannot support..." "The church hasn't been paying my mortgage, Reverend Michaels." Margaret surprised herself with the steel in her voice. "Nor has it been feeding my son or fixing my roof. So perhaps the church might let me handle my own affairs." She turned away from the Reverend's shocked expression and found Eli watching her with something that might have been respect. "Follow me," she said curtly, "and stay away from the house until I say otherwise." The walk back to her property at the edge of town felt like it took hours instead of 15 minutes. She was acutely aware of Eli walking 10 paces behind her, his footsteps steady and unhurried. Aware, too, of the faces in windows, the conversations stopping as they passed, the way Mrs. Henderson pulled her children inside and shut the door. The Hale farm, if it could still be called that, sprawled across 40 acres of prairie, most of it unworked for the past year. The house itself was a modest 2-story structure built by Garrett's father before the war. It had been solid once. Now it listed slightly to the east, several windows were cracked, and the porch steps were rotted through in places. The barn was worse. Margaret stopped at the property line and turned. Eli had paused as well, taking in the broken fences, the weed-choked fields, the general air of neglect that hung over everything. "It's not much," she said, hating the defensive note in her voice. "It's honest work needing done," Eli replied. "That's more than some men get." She pointed toward the barn. "There's a stall in the back. It's not fancy, but it's dry, mostly. You'll find some blankets in the tack room. They're moth-eaten but serviceable. Water pumps by the house, but don't come to the house unless I call for you. Clear?" "Yes, ma'am." "Breakfast is at 6. I'll bring something out to you. Lunch at noon, same thing. Supper at 6 in the evening. You work until I tell you to stop, and you don't speak to my son unless I'm present. Understood?" "Understood." Margaret started toward the house, then turned back. "Mr. Mercer? Why did you answer my advertisement? Surely there were other opportunities for a man with your history." Eli set down his bag and met her eyes. In the fading light, she could see they were gray, like storm clouds over distant mountains. "Most places, ma'am, they see the past and nothing else. Your letter, it asked for honesty and hard work. Didn't mention what a man should look like or where he should come from. Just what he should do." He paused. "Figured maybe you'd see the work before you saw the worker. Turns out that was foolish of me." "Maybe it was," Margaret said, but something in her chest twisted. "Or maybe I'm the fool for not sending you away immediately." She left him there and walked to her house, very aware that by tomorrow the entire county would know what she'd done. Her neighbors would shun her, the church would condemn her. And Thomas? God, what would she tell Thomas? Inside, the house was cold. She'd let the fire die down to save wood. Her son sat at the rough-hewn table, laboriously copying his letters onto a slate, his tongue poking out in concentration. He looked up when she entered, his father's blue eyes bright in his thin face. "Was that the man from the letter?" Thomas asked. "Is he going to be my new papa?" Margaret felt her heart crack a little more. "I don't know, honey. We'll see. Billy Henderson says the man's a criminal, says he killed somebody." Of course Billy Henderson would say that. Martha's boy never could keep his mouth shut, just like his mother. "Billy Henderson should mind his own business," Margaret said, more sharply than she intended. She softened her tone. "The man is going to do some work around the farm, that's all. He'll be staying in the barn for a few days." "Can I meet him?" "No." "But Mama—" "Thomas Garrett Hale, I said no. Now finish your letters and get ready for bed." Her son's face fell, but he bent back over his slate. Margaret moved to the window and looked out toward the barn. A lamp had been lit inside. She could see the faint glow through the gaps in the wood. What was Eli Mercer doing out there? Regretting his decision to come here? Planning his escape? Planning something worse? She pulled the curtain shut and tried not to think about the fact that she'd just invited a convicted killer onto her property, into proximity with her only child, into her life. Desperate times, she told herself. Desperate measures. But desperation, she knew, could make a person reckless, and recklessness could get you killed. The next morning came too quickly. Margaret woke before dawn, as she always did, and lay in the darkness listening to the wind rattle the loose shingles on the roof. Another repair Garrett had never gotten around to. Another thing on an endless list of things that needed doing. She dressed in the cold, pulling on her plainest work dress and the heavy boots she wore for farm chores. In the kitchen, she made coffee and cornmeal mush, setting aside a portion for Eli before she could talk herself out of it. No matter what he'd done, she'd promised him meals in exchange for work. She'd keep her word. Thomas stumbled down the stairs as she was heading toward the door, his hair sticking up in all directions. "Stay inside," she told him. "I'll be back in 10 minutes." The morning was crisp and clear, the kind of fall day that would have been beautiful under different circumstances. Margaret crossed the yard, her boots crunching on the frost-stiffened grass, very aware of the plate in her hands and the strange situation she'd created. The barn door was ajar. She hesitated, then called out, "Mr. Mercer?" "Here, ma'am." His voice came from somewhere in the back. She pushed the door open wider and stepped inside. The barn smelled of old hay and horse, though they'd sold the horses months ago, and something else. Fresh sawdust. She looked around in confusion. Eli emerged from the back stall, wiping his hands on a rag. He'd rolled up his sleeves despite the cold, and she could see more clearly the marks on his wrists, the rope-like scars that spoke of shackles worn for years. "Morning, Mrs. Hale." He nodded at the plate in her hands. "That's kind of you." "You've been working already?" She looked past him and felt her mouth fall open. The stall he'd slept in had been completely cleaned out, the rotted wood replaced with fresh lumber. Where had he gotten lumber? The floor had been swept clean and covered with fresh straw. The tack room door, which had been hanging at an angle for months, now sat square in its frame. "Found some planks stored in the loft," Eli explained, following her gaze. "Looked like they'd been there a while. Figured they wouldn't be missed. The door just needed the hinges tightened, and I... He stopped abruptly. I'm sorry, ma'am. You said to wait until you told me to work. I should have... No, it's... Margaret struggled to find words. It's fine. Good work. She set the plate down on a barrel that now stood upright instead of on its side. There's more that needs doing, obviously. The fence line by the road is falling down. The chicken coop has a hole in it. Something's been getting in and taking eggs. The porch steps are dangerous and... I saw, Eli said quietly. If you could make me a list, ma'am, I'll work through it. Best I can, anyway. Margaret nodded stiffly. I'll do that. You eat your breakfast. There's a hammer and some nails in the workshop, such as it is, attached to the back of the barn. Start with the fence. People see it from the road, and I'd rather not have them saying... She stopped. Saying what? That she'd brought a criminal onto her property and couldn't even keep him busy enough to stay out of trouble? I understand, ma'am, Eli said, saving her from finishing the thought. She turned to go, then paused. Mr. Mercer, thank you for the work you've already done. No thanks needed. It's what I'm here for. Margaret walked back to the house, feeling thoroughly unsettled. She'd expected what? Sullenness, entitlement, some sign of the violence that must live inside a man who'd killed another human being. Instead, she'd found someone who'd worked through the night to make a drafty barn stall habitable and to begin repairs she hadn't even asked for yet. It didn't make sense. Thomas was waiting by the window when she returned. Did you see him? What's he like? He's working on the fence, Margaret said, busying herself with cleaning up the breakfast dishes. And that's all you need to know. Is he mean? Thomas, Billy says men in prison are mean, says they fight and steal and hurt people. Margaret set down the dish she was holding and knelt in front of her son. Listen to me, Thomas. I don't know what kind of man Mr. Mercer is yet, but I do know that people make mistakes, and sometimes those mistakes are very serious. And sometimes, she paused, choosing her words carefully. Sometimes people change. The man working on our fence has paid for whatever he did wrong. Now he's trying to start over. Can you understand that? Thomas's small face was solemn. I guess. Are you going to marry him? The question caught her off guard. That's not... We're just seeing if he can help with the farm. That's all. But your letter said you wanted a husband. Thomas Garrett Hale. That's enough questions for one morning. Go get your school books. Mrs. Patterson will be expecting you. Her son trudged off, clearly dissatisfied with her answers. Margaret couldn't blame him. She was dissatisfied with them herself. The morning passed in a haze of chores. She baked bread, mended a ripped skirt, cleaned out the cold cellar. Every so often, she found herself drifting to the window to look out at the road, where she could see Eli working on the fence line. He moved with steady efficiency, measuring twice before cutting, setting posts that would actually last instead of the hasty repairs Garrett had favored. Around mid-morning, she saw Ben Calhoun ride up on his spotted gelding. Ben was the closest thing to a neighbor she had, his property butting up against hers to the north. He was a decent man, widowed himself 2 years ago, and he'd been kind to her after Garrett died. He'd also made it clear, in the gentle way of a man who didn't want to presume, that he'd be interested in courting her when appropriate time had passed. She watched as Ben dismounted and approached Eli. The two men spoke for several minutes, Ben gesturing toward something in the distance, Eli nodding. Then Ben climbed back on his horse and rode toward the house. Margaret met him at the door. Ben, coffee? No thank you, Margaret. Can't stay. He removed his hat, turning it in his hands. Just wanted to check on you. Heard about your visitor. News travels fast. Always does. His weathered face was troubled. Martha Yates told half the town. Says she recognized him from when he came through on the prison transport last summer, being moved to Laramie. I didn't know. No reason you would have. Ben glanced back toward the fence line. He tell you what he did? Killed a man. Manslaughter. Ben was quiet for a moment. That's a hard thing, Margaret. A hard thing to have near your boy. He's here to work, Ben. That's all. Is it? Ben's tone was gentle, but there was something in his eyes. Hurt, maybe. Or disappointment. Because folks are saying you brought him here as a potential husband. That you're planning to... Folks can say what they like, Margaret cut in, more sharply than she intended. I needed help with the farm. I advertised for it. Mr. Mercer answered. End of story. And when you found out about his past? I gave him 4 days to prove himself. If he can do the work and cause no trouble, I'll consider keeping him on. If not, he leaves Thursday on the stage. Ben studied her for a long moment. You always were stubborn, Margaret Hale, even when we were children. You get an idea in your head, and God himself couldn't talk you out of it. Maybe that's what it takes to survive out here. Maybe. He put his hat back on. But stubbornness can also get you hurt. If you need anything, if there's any trouble, you send Thomas to fetch me, day or night. You hear? I hear. Thank you, Ben. After he rode away, Margaret stood on the porch for a long time, watching Eli work. He'd stripped down to his shirt despite the cold, his breath making clouds in the crisp air. The fence was already taking shape straight and true, the posts sunk deep enough to withstand the prairie winds. Lunch came and went in the same way as breakfast, Margaret delivering a plate, Eli accepting it with quiet gratitude and no presumption. She'd made a list of repairs, and he read through it carefully, asking a few questions about priorities, but mainly just nodding. The chicken coop first, he said. Can't have you losing eggs. Then the porch steps. That's a safety issue, especially with your boy going in and out. After that, I'll work on the list in order, if that suits you. That's fine, she hesitated. You're working very hard. It's what you're paying me for. I'm not paying you anything, just food and a place to sleep for 4 days. Something shifted in Eli's expression. That's more than I've had in 5 years, ma'am. That's worth working hard for. The words hit her harder than they should have. 5 years. 5 years of prison meals, prison routine, prison walls. She tried to imagine it and couldn't. That evening, after Thomas was in bed, Margaret sat at the kitchen table with Garrett's old ledger, trying to make the numbers work. They didn't. They never did. She owed money to Hodges at the Mercantile, to Patterson for Thomas's schooling, to the bank for the mortgage. The winter wheat might help, if she could get it planted in time. If the winter wasn't too harsh, if the price held steady. Too many ifs. She needed help. That was the simple truth. She needed someone who could plow and plant and harvest, someone who could fix what was broken and maintain what still worked. She needed a partner in the truest sense of the word, and she'd invited a killer into her home to fill that role. The thought should have terrified her. Instead, she found herself thinking about the way Eli had worked that day, steadily, thoroughly, without complaint, the way he'd asked permission before starting each new task, the way he kept his distance, never presuming, never pushing. You're being foolish, she told herself. 4 days of good behavior doesn't erase 5 years in prison, doesn't erase whatever he did to get there. But a small voice in the back of her mind whispered, maybe 4 days is enough to see if a man is trying to change. Wednesday morning dawned cold and gray, with the smell of snow in the air. The first storm of the season was coming, probably within the next day or two. Margaret hurried through her morning routine, anxious to check on the farm's preparations. When she stepped outside, she stopped dead. The chicken coop had been completely repaired, the hole patched and reinforced. But more than that, Eli had built a small enclosure attached to it, giving the chickens room to scratch without risking predators. The porch steps had been replaced entirely, the new wood still fragrant with sawdust. And there, leaning against the side of the house, were 3 cords of firewood, split, stacked, and covered with a tarp she recognized from the barn. "Morning, Mrs. Hale?" She turned to find Eli coming from the barn, carrying 2 buckets of water from the pump. He looked exhausted, dark circles under his eyes. But there was something in his expression. Satisfaction, maybe. Pride in work well done. How did you? She gestured helplessly at the wood. Found a dead oak on the back 40, he explained. Figured it was better used here than rotting in the field. Worked on it last night after supper. Couldn't sleep anyway. You should have asked. You're right, I apologize. Margaret shook her head slowly. I'm not angry, Mr. Mercer. I'm just confused, overwhelmed, beginning to see you as something more than a convicted criminal. Thank you. Storm's coming, Eli said, setting down the buckets. I'd like to finish reinforcing the barn roof before it hits, if that's acceptable. And there's a gap in the foundation of the house, north side near the cellar door. Mice and worse could get through come winter. I could seal it this afternoon. Yes. All right? She looked at him more carefully. Have you slept at all? Some. You need rest, Mr. Mercer. You're no good to me if you work yourself to collapse. Something flickered across his face, surprise, maybe that she'd expressed concern. I'll rest when the work's done, ma'am. Always have. He moved to walk past her, but Margaret put out a hand, not touching him, just halting his progress. Why? She asked. Why are you doing all this? You could have done the bare minimum, kept your head down for 4 days, and been on your way. Why push so hard? Eli was quiet for a long moment, his gray eyes distant. Because, Mrs. Hale, I spent 5 years being told I was worthless, being treated like an animal, being reminded every single day that I'd thrown away my chance at a decent life. He met her gaze. This is my chance to prove them wrong, to prove I'm still a man worth something, maybe the only chance I'll get. The raw honesty in his voice made her throat tight. The stage leaves tomorrow. I know. I have to decide by then. I know that too. Margaret took a breath. Have supper with us tonight. Inside. I think Thomas should meet you properly, before I decide. Eli's expression didn't change, but she saw his hands tighten on the bucket handles. Are you certain? No, but I'm doing it anyway. That evening, Margaret set the table with her grandmother's dishes, the ones she only used for special occasions. She wasn't sure why. This wasn't a celebration. But somehow it felt important to mark the occasion, to signal that this meal meant something. Thomas had been nervous all afternoon, asking a dozen questions she couldn't answer. What if he's scary? What if he doesn't like me? What if he says bad words? When the knock came at the door, Margaret took a deep breath and opened it. Eli stood on the porch, the new, sturdy porch, wearing what must have been his only clean shirt. He'd shaved and combed his wet hair back. He looked young, suddenly, and deeply uncomfortable. Mr. Mercer, come in. He stepped inside carefully, as if the floor might give way beneath him. His eyes moved around the room, taking in the modest furnishings, the sampler on the wall, the photograph of Garrett in his wedding suit. His gaze lingered on that photograph for a moment before moving on. Thomas stood by the table, his eyes wide. Thomas, Margaret said gently, this is Mr. Mercer. Mr. Mercer, my son, Thomas. Pleased to meet you, Thomas. Eli didn't extend his hand, didn't move closer. He seemed to understand instinctively that the boy needed space. Did you really kill somebody? The question burst out of Thomas before Margaret could stop him. Thomas! It's all right, ma'am. Eli crouched down slowly, bringing himself to Thomas's eye level. Yes, son, I did. It's the worst thing I've ever done, and I think about it every single day. I wish I could take it back, but I can't. Were you scared? In prison? Sometimes. Yes. Are you going to hurt us? No. Eli's voice was absolutely steady. I promise you that. I made a terrible mistake a long time ago, and I paid for it. But I would never, ever hurt you or your mother. That's the God's honest truth. Thomas studied him with the unnerving intensity of childhood. Okay, he said finally. Mama says you're good at fixing things. I try to be. Can you fix Papa's watch? It stopped working. Eli glanced at Margaret, who nodded slightly. I could take a look at it, no promises, but I'll do my best. Dinner was awkward at first, stilted conversation and long silences. But gradually, as Thomas's natural curiosity overcame his nervousness, things eased. He peppered Eli with questions about the farm repairs, about how you know which wood to use where, about whether he'd ever seen a buffalo. Eli answered each question thoughtfully, seriously, never talking down to the boy. And Margaret noticed something. He was good with Thomas, patient, kind, the kind of father a boy needed. After Thomas went to bed, clutching his father's pocket watch with Eli's promise to look at it in the morning, Margaret and Eli sat at the table with coffee growing cold between them. He's a good boy, Eli said quietly. He is. He deserves better than this. She gestured vaguely at the room, but meant something larger, the poverty, the struggle, the uncertainty. He has a mother who loves him and works herself to the bone for him. That's more than some children get. Margaret looked at Eli, really looked at him. In the lamplight, with his guard slightly lowered, she could see the man behind the convict, behind the tragedy. She could see someone trying desperately to be better than his worst moment. "Tell me what happened," she said. "The truth. All of it. I need to know before I decide." Eli stared into his coffee cup for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and rough with memory. "His name was Jonas Pike." "His name was Jonas Pike," Eli began, his fingers tracing the rim of his coffee cup, as if the circular motion could somehow smooth out the jagged edges of memory. "We worked together on a cattle ranch outside Cheyenne. This was 7 years ago now. I was young, thought I knew everything. Jonas was older, maybe 40, and he had a way about him, smooth-talking, always knew the right thing to say to the boss, to the other hands, to the town girls who'd come out to watch us work." Margaret sat perfectly still, afraid that any movement might break the thread of his confession. "There was a boy working there too, Miguel. Couldn't have been more than 15, 16, came up from Mexico with his uncle, looking for honest work. Quiet kid, worked harder than any 2 men combined, sent every penny back to his mother." Eli's jaw tightened. "Jonas took a dislike to him from the start. Called him names, knocked his food tin over accidentally, that sort of thing. Small cruelties that add up." The lamp flickered, casting shifting shadows across Eli's face. Outside, the wind had picked up, rattling the windows. The promised storm was getting closer. "One night, money went missing from the bunkhouse. 3 months' wages from one of the other hands. Jonas started saying Miguel must have taken it, started working the other men up about it. Said you couldn't trust his kind, said the boy was probably laughing at us while we slept." Eli's voice had gone flat, as if emotion would make it impossible to continue. "A group of them cornered Miguel in the barn. I was coming back from checking the fence line, heard the commotion." "What were they doing?" Margaret asked, though part of her didn't want to know. "What angry men do when they convince themselves someone deserves punishment. They had a rope." Eli looked up at her then, and in his eyes she saw something ancient and terrible. Jonas was holding it. He had the noose already made. They were going to hang that boy, Margaret, right there in the barn, no trial, no proof, just their certainty and their hate. Margaret felt her blood run cold. "What did you do?" "I told them to stop, tried to reason with them, but Jonas, he just smiled at me. Said if I wasn't with them, I was against them. Said maybe I was in on the theft with Miguel." Eli's hands had balled into fists on the table. The boy was crying, begging in Spanish. None of them cared. They were going to do it. "So you shot Jonas?" "No." Eli shook his head. "I hit him, knocked him down, tried to get the rope away from him. The other men, they hesitated. I think part of them knew what they were doing was wrong, but mob thinking is a powerful thing. In that moment, while they were uncertain, I told Miguel to run. He did. Got out through the back of the barn and disappeared into the night. Then Jonas got up. He was furious, screaming that I'd let a thief escape, that I was a traitor. He came at me with a pitchfork." Eli's voice had dropped barely above a whisper. "We fought. I was younger, stronger, but he was vicious. Mean in a way I'd never encountered. At some point, his gun fell from his holster. I got to it first." The silence stretched between them. Margaret could hear the clock ticking on the mantel, each second marking the space between past and present. "I told him to back off, told all of them to just stop, to think about what they were doing. But Jonas, he laughed, said I didn't have the spine to pull the trigger, started coming toward me." Eli's eyes were distant now, seeing something Margaret couldn't. "I fired a warning shot, over his head, into the rafters. But he didn't stop, kept coming. Said he was going to kill me, then he was going to find Miguel and finish what he started." "You believed him." "I knew him, Margaret, knew what he was capable of. I'd seen him beat a horse near to death for stumbling, seen him break a man's arm in a card game dispute. He wasn't bluffing." Eli met her eyes. "So I shot him, center mass. He went down and didn't get up." Margaret absorbed this, trying to reconcile the quiet man sitting at her table with the violence of that night. "The court called it manslaughter?" "The other men testified that Jonas was unarmed when I shot him, that I'd taken his gun and used it on him. They conveniently forgot about the pitchfork, about the rope, about what they'd been planning to do to Miguel." His voice carried no bitterness, just resignation. My lawyer argued self-defense, but the judge said I should have found another way. Said taking a life is never justified except in the most extreme circumstances, and I hadn't met that burden of proof. That's not fair. He was coming at you, threatening you. The law doesn't always care about fair, Mrs. Hale. It cares about what can be proven. And what could be proven was that I shot an unarmed man in a barn full of witnesses who all told the same story. He paused. Even if I'd been acquitted, though, I'm not sure I'd feel any different. I took a life. That's a weight that doesn't lift, regardless of the reasons. Margaret thought about this for a long moment. What happened to Miguel? For the first time, something like warmth touched Eli's expression. He made it back to Mexico, sent me a letter during my first year in prison. Said he'd made it home safe, told his mother what I'd done. She wanted me to know she prayed for me every day. He pulled a worn envelope from his shirt pocket, the paper soft from repeated handling. I've read this letter 1,000 times. It's the only thing that got me through some of the darker days. Knowing that boy lived, that he got home to his family. It doesn't make what I did right, but it makes it mean something. Margaret reached across the table, her hand hovering near his for a moment before she pulled back. The gesture was small, but Eli noticed. She saw his eyes track the movement, saw something flicker in them, hope, maybe, or the faint possibility of it. You saved that boy's life, she said quietly. Whatever the court decided, whatever the law said, you saved him. At the cost of another life. At the cost of a man who was about to commit murder. There's a difference, Eli. It was the first time she'd used his given name, and the effect was immediate. He looked at her with such raw gratitude that she had to glance away, her cheeks warming. I don't expect you to keep me on, he said. I know what I'm asking, for you to trust me, to have me around your son, after what I've told you. Stop. Margaret stood up, walked to the window. She could see her reflection in the dark glass, and behind it, Eli's form at the table. I need to think. The stage comes tomorrow afternoon. I'll have my answer by morning. Yes, ma'am. He rose, moving toward the door. Thank you for supper and for listening. After he'd gone back to the barn, Margaret stood at the window for a long time, watching the lamplight spill from the barn door. She thought about Garrett, about the lies he'd told and the debts he'd hidden. She thought about Jonas Pike and Miguel, about justice and mercy, about the difference between law and right. She thought about her son, asleep upstairs, and the kind of man she wanted him to become. Most of all, she thought about the way Eli had looked when he spoke of that boy making it home to Mexico. The way his whole face had changed, as if that one piece of good was enough to justify everything else he'd endured. The decision, she realized, had already been made. She'd made it the moment Eli had looked her son in the eye and told him the truth without flinching, without making excuses. She'd made it when he'd built her a woodpile at midnight because a storm was coming. She'd made it when he'd shown her that a man's worst moment didn't have to define all his moments to come. She just needed the courage to stand by it. The storm hit around midnight, hard and fast like they always did on the prairie. Margaret woke to the sound of wind howling around the eaves and rain hammering the roof. She thought about Eli in the barn, hoped the repairs he'd made to the roof were holding. Started to drift back to sleep. Then she heard the crash. She was out of bed and down the stairs before she'd fully registered moving, grabbing Garrett's old coat from the hook by the door. Through the window, she could see the barn door swinging wildly in the wind. Something was wrong. Mama? Thomas stood at the top of the stairs, his voice frightened. Stay inside, she called back, then plunged out into the storm. The rain hit her like a physical blow, cold and sharp. She could barely see 3 feet in front of her, but she fought her way toward the barn, her boots slipping in the mud. The wind tore at her nightgown beneath the coat, and she was soaked through in seconds. Eli! She screamed, but the wind ripped the words away. She reached the barn and grabbed the swinging door, wrestling it closed. Inside was chaos. The repairs to the roof were holding, but one of the old support beams had given way, bringing down part of the hayloft. And there, pinned beneath a massive beam, was Eli. Oh, God! Margaret ran to him, falling to her knees in the scattered hay. Eli, can you hear me? His eyes opened, pain-glazed and unfocused. Margaret? Her name came out as barely a whisper. Get out. Not safe. I'm not leaving you. She grabbed the beam, tried to lift it. It didn't budge. Can you move? Anything broken? Don't know. Can't feel my legs. His voice was strained, each word clearly an effort. Margaret, the barn, the whole thing could come down. Get back to the house. Shut up. She looked around frantically. There had to be something, some way to lever the beam up. Her eyes fell on a length of pipe, probably from some old repair job. It wasn't much, but it might work. She wedged the pipe under the beam, using a barrel as a fulcrum. When I lift this, you pull yourself out. Understand? You can't. I said shut up, Eli Mercer. She positioned herself, planted her feet. On 3. 1, 2, 3. She threw all her weight onto the pipe. The beam shifted, maybe an inch, maybe 2. It was enough. Eli gritted his teeth and dragged himself backward, his face going white with pain. The moment he was clear, Margaret let go and the beam crashed back down, missing him by inches. Can you stand? She was already moving, getting her shoulder under his arm. I don't. He tried to put weight on his left leg and nearly went down. Ankle. Think it's twisted, not broken. Good enough? Together they staggered toward the door. Another beam groaned overhead, and Margaret's heart jumped into her throat. Move, move, move! They burst out of the barn just as something gave way behind them. Margaret didn't look back, just kept moving, half carrying Eli through the storm. By the time they reached the porch, both of them were shaking, whether from cold or shock she couldn't tell. Thomas had the door open, his eyes huge. Mama, is he okay? Help me get him to the sofa. Between them, they managed to get Eli inside and onto the worn cushions. He was breathing hard, his face pale as milk. Thomas, get blankets, all of them, and stoke the fire. Her son ran to obey while Margaret knelt beside Eli, checking him over. His ankle was already swelling, angry purple and red. She touched it gently and he hissed. Definitely twisted, maybe sprained. We'll need to wrap it. She looked up at his face. What else hurts? Everything. He managed a weak smile. But I don't think anything's broken except my dignity. You shouldn't have come out there. You would have died. Better than you getting hurt trying to save me. Margaret sat back on her heels, suddenly furious. Don't you dare! Don't you dare act like your life doesn't matter, like it would have been acceptable for you to die out there because of what you did 7 years ago. Eli stared at her, water dripping from his hair into his eyes. Margaret, no, listen to me. She grabbed his hand, not caring that Thomas was coming back with blankets, not caring about propriety or what was proper. What you did, saving that boy, that matters. The work you've done here, the way you've treated my son, the way you've shown up every single day and tried to be better, that matters. You matter. I killed a man, and you've spent 7 years paying for it. At some point, Eli, you have to forgive yourself, because She stopped, the words catching in her throat. Because I've decided. I'm asking you to stay, not just for 4 days, for as long as you want to, as my hired hand, as my... She took a breath. As my partner. If you'll have us. Thomas wrapped a blanket around Eli's shoulders, his young face serious. Please stay, Mr. Mercer. We need you. Eli looked between them, this woman and this boy who were offering him something he'd thought he'd never have again. A home, a chance, a future. I don't deserve this. None of us deserve half of what we get in this life, good or bad, Margaret said. But we're here, and you're here, and I'm choosing to believe that means something. So what do you say? For a long moment, Eli said nothing. Then, slowly, he nodded. I'll stay, long as you'll have me. Margaret felt something tight in her chest loosen. Good. Now let's get you out of these wet clothes before you catch your death. Thomas, fetch some of your father's things from the trunk upstairs. As her son ran off, Margaret began unlacing Eli's boots, her hands steady despite everything. The barn's probably a total loss. I'll rebuild it, better than before. His voice was hoarse. Margaret, you could have been killed. So could you. Guess we're even. She glanced up at him. Besides, I had to save you. You promised to fix Thomas's watch, and I'm holding you to that. A sound escaped Eli that might have been a laugh or a sob or something in between. You're the most stubborn woman I've ever met. You've mentioned that before. She stood, brushed the hay from her knees. And you haven't seen anything yet. Wait until you try to argue with me about crop rotation. Over the next few days, as Eli recuperated and the storm cleared, something shifted between them. It wasn't romance, not yet. There was too much uncertainty, too much history to work through. But it was the beginning of something. Trust, maybe. Or understanding. The town, of course, had opinions. When news spread that Margaret had officially hired Eli on as her farmhand, that he was living in the house now, in the spare room, she was quick to clarify, though no one seemed to care about that detail, the gossip reached a fever pitch. Reverend Michaels came by to express his concerns. Margaret listened politely, then showed him the door when he suggested she was setting a bad example for Thomas. Martha Yates stopped speaking to her entirely, which Margaret privately considered a blessing. But Ben Calhoun's visit hurt more. He came by on a cold November morning, his face troubled. "I hear you've made your decision," he said, standing awkwardly in her kitchen. "I have." Margaret poured him coffee, though she suspected he wouldn't stay long enough to drink it. "Margaret, I thought—" He stopped, started again. "I had hoped that you and I that in time, we might—" "I know, Ben, and I'm grateful for your friendship, but this is what's right for me and Thomas. I'm sorry if that hurts you." He set down his cup, coffee untouched. "Is it him? The convict? Are you—" "His name is Eli. And no, it's not like that. He works for me. He's good with Thomas, that's all." Even as she said it, she knew it wasn't quite true. Wasn't quite all. But it was true enough for now. "The town won't forget what he did, Margaret. They won't let you forget." "Then I suppose the town and I will have to learn to live with our differences." After Ben left, Margaret stood at the window, watching Eli teach Thomas how to properly stack firewood. Her son's laughter drifted through the glass, the first real laughter she'd heard from him in months. "No, like this," Eli was saying, demonstrating the proper technique. "See how they fit together? It's like a puzzle. Each piece supports the others." "Like a family," Thomas said, and Margaret's throat went tight. "Yeah, son, like a family." That evening, after Thomas was in bed, Margaret and Eli sat by the fire, as had become their habit. They didn't talk much. Eli wasn't a man of many words, and Margaret was learning to appreciate silence after years of Garrett's constant chatter. But the quiet between them was comfortable, companionable. "Jonas Pike," she said suddenly. Was that his real name? Eli looked up from the watch he was working on, Thomas's watch, its delicate mechanism spread out on a cloth on his lap. "Why do you ask?" "Because I've been thinking about what you said, about him." She leaned forward. "Men like that, they don't just appear out of nowhere. They have histories, families, people who knew them before they became what they became." "I suppose that's true." "Did he ever talk about his past? Where he came from?" Eli was quiet for a moment, his fingers stilling on the watch gears. "Now that you mention it, he was always cagey about it. Said he came from back east, but he'd never say where specifically, and he went by different names sometimes. Jonas Pike was just what he called himself on the ranch. Different names." Margaret felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. "Eli, what if Jonas wasn't done when you shot him? What if he had unfinished business? People who might come looking?" "He's dead, Margaret. Been dead 7 years." "I know, but..." She couldn't explain the feeling, the sense that there was something more to this story, some thread they hadn't pulled yet. "It's probably nothing, just my imagination." But that night, lying in her bed, Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that the past wasn't quite finished with them yet. 2 weeks later, on a bright December morning, a rider came into Silver Creek asking questions. His name was Cole Hardesty, and he claimed to be a bounty hunter tracking a fugitive. No one thought much of it at first. Bounty hunters came through from time to time, and their business was rarely the town's concern. But then he started asking about Eli Mercer. Martha Yates was the one who told Margaret, appearing on her doorstep with barely contained excitement. "There's a man in town asking about your hired hand. Says he has business with him. Legal business." Margaret felt her stomach drop. "What kind of business?" "Didn't say. But he's carrying a badge and a gun, Margaret. Whatever it is, it's serious." After Martha left, Margaret found Eli in the barn, replacing the beams that had fallen during the storm. There's a bounty hunter in town asking about you. Eli's hammer froze mid-swing. What's his name? Cole Hardesty. The color drained from Eli's face. Did he say what he wants? No, but Eli, if you're in trouble, if there's something you haven't told me, there's nothing. I served my full sentence. I'm not a fugitive. But his hands were shaking as he set down the hammer. Hardesty. I know that name. He stopped, his expression going distant. Margaret, I need you to trust me. Whatever Hardesty says, whatever he claims, I need you to trust me. You're scaring me. I know. I'm sorry, but please. He grabbed her hands, his gray eyes intense. Trust me. Before she could respond, they heard the sound of hooves in the yard. Through the barn door, Margaret saw a man dismount from a bay horse. He was tall, lean, with the hard look of someone who'd spent too long hunting dangerous men. He wore a badge on his vest and a gun on each hip. Eli Mercer, he called out. I know you're in there. Come on out peaceable now. Eli squeezed Margaret's hands once, then let go. Stay here. Like hell. She followed him out into the cold sunlight. Cole Hardesty looked them both over with eyes like chips of ice. You Mercer? I am. State your business. My business is Jonas Pike, or more specifically, what you know about him. Margaret felt Eli tense beside her. Pike's dead. I killed him. Served my time for it. That's what I heard. Thing is, Jonas Pike, if that was even his real name, he's got family looking for him. Family that's been searching for 7 years, trying to find out what happened. Hardesty pulled a photograph from his pocket, held it up. It showed a younger Jonas Pike, clean-shaven and smiling, standing next to a woman and 2 small children. Recognize this? Eli stared at the photograph, his face unreadable. No, never saw that before. His wife, his kids. They want to know where he's buried, want to know why he died. Hardesty's voice was hard. They want to know if the man who killed him ever showed remorse, or if he just walked away like it was nothing. I spent 5 years in prison, Eli said quietly. That's not nothing. Maybe not, but here you are, living free, working, building a new life. Meanwhile, Pike's wife is working herself to the bone back in Illinois, trying to feed those kids without their father. Hardesty stepped closer. So I'm going to ask you one more time, Mercer. What really happened that night? And don't give me the story from the trial. I want the truth. Margaret stepped forward before Eli could respond. Mr. Hardesty, I don't know what you've been told, but Eli served his sentence. He's paid his debt to society. He doesn't owe you or anyone else anything more. With respect, ma'am, that's not for you to decide. Hardesty's eyes never left Eli. Pike's wife hired me to find out what really happened. She deserves answers. Those kids deserve to know how their father died. They deserve to know their father was about to lynch an innocent boy, Eli said, his voice rough. That he was violent and cruel and would have killed a child if someone hadn't stopped him. Is that what you want me to tell them? Hardesty's expression didn't change. I want you to tell them the truth, whatever that is. The 3 of them stood in the cold morning, the weight of the past pressing down like the winter sky. Margaret could see Thomas watching from the house window, his small face worried. She could see the muscle jumping in Eli's jaw, the way his fists had clenched at his sides. Come inside, she heard herself say. If you want answers, Mr. Hardesty, then you'll get them. All of them. But you'll hear the whole story, not just the parts you want to hear. Hardesty considered this, then nodded. Fair enough. As they walked toward the house, Eli leaned close to Margaret. You don't have to do this. Yes, she whispered back. I do. Because the truth matters. For them, for you, for all of us. Inside, Margaret made coffee while Eli told his story again, every detail, nothing held back. Thomas sat in the corner, listening wide-eyed. Hardesty didn't interrupt, just let Eli talk. When Eli finished, Hardesty was quiet for a long time. You got anyone who can back up your version? The boy, Miguel? You know where he is? Mexico, that's all I know. The other ranch hands, they testified against me. Don't expect they'll change their stories now. Hardesty drummed his fingers on the table. So it's your word against theirs. The word of a convict against a dead man's reputation. That's about it. Mr. Hardesty, Margaret said, what exactly do you want from Eli? He's told you what happened. He's served his time. What more is there? Hardesty pulled out a piece of paper, unfolded it carefully. Pike's wife, she wrote me a letter, asked me to deliver it to the man who killed her husband, if I ever found him. Said she needed him to know something. He slid the paper across the table to Eli. Maybe you should read it. Eli picked up the letter with shaking hands. His eyes moved across the page, and Margaret watched his expression change from wariness to confusion to something that might have been grief. When he finished, he set the letter down carefully, as if it might break. What does it say? Margaret asked gently. Eli's voice was barely audible. She says she forgives me. Says Jonas wasn't the man she married. That he changed after the war, became someone she didn't recognize. Says she's glad I'm out of prison, hopes I can build a good life. He looked up at Hardesty. Why would she write this? Because, Hardesty said, she figured out the truth. Took her years, but she tracked down one of the ranch hands. A man named Miller. He was dying of consumption, wanted to clear his conscience, told her everything. About Miguel, about the rope, about what really happened that night. The room went absolutely silent. She knows I'm innocent? She knows Jonas was the villain, not you. Hardesty stood. She wanted me to tell you that, and to give you this. He pulled out a small cloth bag, heavy with coins. It's not much. Money she saved from Jonas's pension. She says it's blood money, and she doesn't want it. Thought maybe you could use it better than she could. Eli stared at the bag like it might bite him. I can't take this. She insisted. Said it might help you build something good, something her husband tried to destroy. Hardesty moved toward the door. I'm sorry for the trouble, Mercer. I had to see for myself, make sure the story checked out. But I've seen enough. You're a good man who did a hard thing. World needs more of those. After Hardesty rode away, Eli sat at the table for a long time, the letter and the money in front of him. Margaret sent Thomas outside to do chores, then sat beside Eli, not speaking, just present. Finally, he looked at her. 7 years. 7 years I've carried this, thinking, his voice broke. Thinking I was a murderer, that I'd taken a man from his family, that nothing I did could ever make up for it. You were never a murderer, Eli. You were a man who saved a life. She forgives me. He said it like he couldn't quite believe it. His own wife forgives me. Then maybe, Margaret said softly, it's time you forgave yourself. Eli looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time since he'd arrived in Silver Creek, she saw something in his eyes that wasn't pain or guilt or regret. She saw peace, the fragile beginning of it anyway. I don't know how, he admitted. Then we'll figure it out together. She took his hand, and this time he held on. Outside, the first snow of December began to fall, covering the prairie in white. Inside, two people who'd been broken by the past began, slowly, carefully, to build something new. The snow kept falling through the afternoon, transforming Silver Creek into something from a Christmas card. Margaret stood at the window, watching Thomas build a snowman in the yard, while Eli stacked the last of the firewood under the eaves. The money from Jonas Pike's widow sat in a tin box on the mantel, untouched. Eli hadn't been able to bring himself to use it yet, though Margaret had pointed out more than once that the farm needed supplies and winter was only getting harsher. It doesn't feel right, he'd said that morning, his hands wrapped around a coffee cup, using money that came from his death. She wanted you to have it, wanted something good to come from something terrible. Margaret had touched his shoulder briefly. That's grace, Eli. Don't turn away from it. But grace, she was learning, was harder to accept than judgment. Eli had spent 7 years believing himself irredeemable, and old beliefs died hard. The sound of hooves drew her attention. A wagon was making its way up the road, and Margaret's heart sank when she recognized the driver. Samuel Hodges, who ran the mercantile and held the note on most of her store credit. He wasn't the type to make social calls, especially not in weather like this. Eli noticed the wagon, too. He set down the wood he was carrying and moved toward the house, arriving just as Hodges climbed down from his seat. Mrs. Hale, Hodges said, touching his hat brim. His eyes slid to Eli with barely concealed distaste. Mercer. Mr. Hodges, Margaret kept her voice neutral. What brings you out in this weather? Business, I'm afraid. He pulled a ledger from inside his coat. Your account's 3 months past due. I've been patient, given your circumstances, but I can't extend credit indefinitely. Margaret felt her face flush. I know I owe you money. I was planning to settle up after the spring planting when... That's 6 months away, Mrs. Hale. I need payment now. At least half of what you owe. He glanced at Eli again. I understand you've taken on help. Perhaps that means your situation has improved. Mr. Hodges, if I had the money, I'd pay you. But right now, $200, Hodges interrupted. That's half your debt. I need it by the end of January, or I'll have to take legal action. I don't want to do that, but I have my own family to think about. $200 might as well have been $2,000. Margaret felt the familiar weight of desperation settling over her shoulders like a yoke. I understand. I'll find a way. After Hodges left, she stood on the porch, arms wrapped around herself against the cold. Eli came to stand beside her, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. The money from Mrs. Pike, he finally said. How much is in that bag? Eli, no. How much, Margaret? She closed her eyes. I don't know. I haven't counted it. Let's count it. Inside, Eli poured the contents of the cloth bag onto the table. Coins gleamed in the lamplight. Silver dollars, half-dollars, quarters. They counted in silence, Thomas watching with wide eyes from his seat by the fire. $243, Eli said when they finished. More than enough to pay Hodges. I can't take your money. It's not my money. It's blood money, remember? Mrs. Pike's words. He pushed the coins toward her. She wanted it to build something good. What's more good than keeping your farm, keeping Thomas's home? Margaret stared at the money, her throat tight. If we use this, we'll have nothing left for seed, for supplies. Then I'll work. There's other farms around here, other places that need help. I can hire out for spring planting, bring in enough to cover what we need. He leaned forward. Margaret, let me do this. Let me help. You already help. Every day, I live in your house. I eat your food. I sleep under a real roof for the first time in 7 years. His voice was rough with emotion. You saved my life in that storm. You stood by me when Hardesty showed up. You believed me when you had no reason to. Let me give something back. Thomas spoke up from his corner. Mama, Mr. Mercer fixed Papa's watch. He makes good on his promises. If he says he'll earn the money back, he will. Both adults turned to look at the boy. He sat there with such solemn certainty, such simple faith, that Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. When did you get so wise? She asked. I'm 7.5 now, almost grown. He said it with such seriousness that despite everything, Margaret smiled. Almost grown, she agreed. She looked back at Eli. If we do this, if I let you pay Hodges, you're not a hired hand anymore. You're a partner, equal share in everything the farm produces. Agreed? Eli's expression shifted. Margaret, I can't. Equal partners, or I don't take the money. Those are my terms. They stared at each other across the table, the coins glinting between them like promises or threats, depending on how you looked at them. Equal partners, Eli finally said. They shook on it, and Margaret tried to ignore the way her heart jumped at the touch of his calloused hand against hers. The next morning, Eli rode into town with the money for Hodges. Margaret watched him go with a mixture of relief and anxiety. $200 would buy them time, but it wouldn't solve all their problems. They still needed seed for spring planting, still needed to repair the barn properly, still needed a dozen other things she couldn't afford. One problem at a time, she told herself. That's how you survived in this country. One problem, one day, one season at a time. Thomas tugged at her skirt. Can we make cookies? For when Mr. Mercer gets back? That's a fine idea. She ruffled his hair. Go fetch the flour tin. They were elbow-deep in dough when they heard the shouting. Margaret's hand stilled, her heart suddenly pounding. That was Eli's voice, and someone else's, raised in anger. Thomas, stay in the house. She wiped her hands on her apron and moved to the door. Outside, 2 riders had cornered Eli near the road. Margaret recognized them immediately, Frank and Billy Sutton, brothers who worked for Ben Calhoun. They were rough men, the kind who settled disputes with fists before words, and right now they looked angry enough to do considerably worse. "Think you can just come into town like you belong here?" Frank, the older one, was saying. He dismounted and stood close to Eli, his hand resting on the knife at his belt. "Think we don't know what you are?" "I'm not looking for trouble," Eli said calmly, though Margaret could see the tension in his shoulders. "Just did some business, and I'm heading home." "Home?" Billy laughed from his horse. "You mean Mrs. Hale's place? That ain't your home, convict. You're just squatting there until she comes to her senses. What I do and where I live is between Mrs. Hale and myself." Eli's voice remained level. "Now, if you'll excuse me," Frank grabbed Eli's arm as he tried to move past. "We're not done talking." "Yes," Margaret called out, walking toward them. "You are." All three men turned to look at her. Frank's expression flickered between surprise and annoyance. "Mrs. Hale, this doesn't concern you." "It concerns me when two men corner my business partner on my property." She stopped beside Eli, close enough that her shoulder nearly brushed his. "State your business or get off my land." "Your business partner?" Billy shook his head. "Ben was right. You've lost your mind taking up with a killer. Mr. Mercer has served his sentence and done nothing but honest work since arriving here. What he did in the past is between him, the law, and God. It's certainly none of your concern." "It's everyone's concern when you bring a dangerous man into a decent town," Frank said. "People have families, children. We got a right to feel safe." "Then feel safe somewhere else." Margaret's voice had gone cold. "This is my property, and you're trespassing. Leave, now." Frank stepped closer, his face ugly with anger. "You think you can talk to us like—" Eli moved, putting himself between Frank and Margaret. He didn't raise his hands, didn't make any threatening gesture, but something in his stance made Frank stop mid-sentence. "The lady asked you to leave," Eli said quietly. "I suggest you do it." For a long moment, the two men locked eyes. Margaret held her breath, aware that this could go very badly, very quickly. Then Billy called out from his horse, "Frank, let's go. This ain't worth it. Ben didn't send us here to start trouble." Frank spat in the dirt near Eli's feet, but he backed away. "This isn't over, Mercer. People like you don't belong here." "People like me?" Eli's voice remained calm, but Margaret heard the steel underneath. "You mean people who've made mistakes and are trying to do better? Or do you mean people who aren't afraid of honest work?" Frank's hand moved toward his knife, and Margaret's heart stopped. But Billy was already wheeling his horse around. "Frank, now!" With a final glare, Frank mounted up, and the brothers rode off, leaving dust and tension in their wake. Margaret waited until they were out of sight before letting out the breath she'd been holding. "Are you all right?" "Fine." But Eli's hands were shaking slightly as he checked the saddlebag that held Hodges' receipt. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to bring trouble to your door." "You didn't bring it. They did." She touched his arm. "Ben sent them, didn't he?" "Seems like." Eli looked toward the road where the Sutton brothers had disappeared. "He's trying to protect you, in his way. Can't entirely blame him for that." "His way is wrong." Margaret's jaw set. "And he needs to understand that I make my own choices. Come on, let's get inside. Thomas and I are making cookies." Over the next few weeks, the tension in Silver Creek grew like ice forming on a pond. Slow, steady, and treacherous. The Sutton brothers weren't the only ones who made their feelings clear. At church, people moved away when Margaret sat down. At the general store, conversation stopped when she entered. Thomas came home from school one day with a black eye, claiming he'd fallen, but Margaret knew better. She'd seen the guilty look on Billy Henderson's face when she'd picked Thomas up. Through it all, Eli kept working. He rebuilt the barn, this time with proper support beams and a roof that could withstand anything Dakota weather threw at it. He fixed the plow, repaired harnesses, and began planning for spring planting. And every evening, he helped Thomas with his schoolwork, teaching the boy mathematics using practical examples from farm work. Margaret watched him with Thomas and felt something shift in her chest. This was what she'd hoped for when she'd placed that advertisement. Someone steady, someone kind, someone who understood that being a man meant more than just strength. But she'd gotten something more complicated than she'd bargained for. She'd gotten someone with a past that shadowed everything. Someone the town would never fully accept. Someone who was teaching her that redemption was possible, but never easy. She'd also gotten someone she was falling in love with, though she wasn't ready to admit that yet, even to herself. It was January when Ben Calhoun finally came to see her properly. He arrived on a Sunday afternoon, hat in hand, his expression grave. "Margaret, we need to talk." She let him in, offered coffee, which he accepted. They sat at the kitchen table, the same table where she'd heard Eli's confession, where they'd counted Mrs. Pike's money, where so many important moments had unfolded. "I owe you an apology," Ben said without preamble, "for sending Frank and Billy to confront Mercer. That was wrong of me." "Yes, it was. But my concern for you, that's not wrong, Margaret. You're making a mistake with this man. The whole town sees it, even if you don't." "What mistake am I making, Ben? Giving someone a second chance, believing that a man can change? You're risking everything, your reputation, your son's future, your safety, for a convict you barely know." Ben leaned forward. "I care about you. I've cared about you for a long time, and it pains me to see you throw away your chance at a decent life. And you think you could give me that? A decent life? I could try. I've got a successful farm, no debts, standing in the community. I could give Thomas a stable home, a proper father." He reached across the table, covered her hand with his. "I could give you security, Margaret, respectability, things you can't have with Mercer." Margaret looked at Ben's hand on hers, clean, uncalloused, the hand of a man who had workers to do the hardest labor. A good hand, attached to a good man, a safe choice. Then she thought of Eli's hands, scarred, rough, marked by years of hard labor and harder consequences. Hands that had killed a man but had also saved a boy's life. Hands that fixed things patiently, that ruffled Thomas's hair, that shook when he was trying not to show emotion. She pulled her hand away gently. "Ben, I appreciate your concern. I do, but I'm not looking for respectability. I'm looking for honesty. And Eli has given me that from the start." "Even when he lied about his past?" "He didn't lie. He just didn't volunteer information I didn't ask for." She stood, moved to the window. Outside, she could see Eli teaching Thomas how to care for the chickens. "You want to know what I see when I look at him? I see a man who works until his hands bleed, who sleeps in a cold barn without complaint, who looks my son in the eye and tells him the truth, even when the truth makes him look bad. That's worth more to me than any reputation. And when the town turns completely against you, when Thomas can't go to school without being bullied, when merchants won't serve you," Ben's voice was strained. "What then, Margaret?" "Then we'll deal with it, together." Ben stood slowly, his face sad. "You're in love with him." The words hung in the air between them. Margaret wanted to deny it, but the denial wouldn't come. "Maybe I am," she said quietly. "Or maybe I'm just learning what it means to see someone for who they really are, not who I want them to be." After Ben left, Margaret stood at the window for a long time. She watched Eli and Thomas in the yard, watched the easy companionship between them, watched her son laugh at something Eli said, and she admitted to herself what she'd been avoiding for weeks. She was in love with Eli Mercer. Deeply, terrifyingly in love with a man who'd killed someone, who'd spent 5 years in prison, who most of the town believed was dangerous. She was in love with his quiet strength, his bone-deep honesty, his determination to be better than his worst moment. She was in love with the way he looked at her son, the way he fixed broken things, the way he accepted judgment without complaint, but never stopped trying to prove himself worthy. And that love was going to cost her everything she had left. That night, after Thomas was asleep, she found Eli in the barn. He was working on a new chicken coop by lantern light, his breath forming clouds in the cold air. "You should be inside," she said. "It's freezing out here." Wanted to finish this, Thomas was excited about having more chickens come spring. He looked up at her, and in the golden lamplight his face was all angles and shadows. "Something wrong?" "Ben came by today." Eli's hand stilled on the wood he was planing. "What did he want?" "To offer me a better life, a respectable one." She moved closer. "He asked me to choose, him or you." "And what did you say?" Margaret took a breath, gathering courage. "I said I choose honesty. I choose someone who sees me as a partner, not someone to be managed. I choose. She paused. I choose you, Eli. If you'll have me. The plane fell from Eli's hands, clattering on the barn floor. He stared at her as if she'd spoken a foreign language. Margaret, you can't. You don't. He shook his head. You deserve better than me. Stop telling me what I deserve. She closed the distance between them, close enough to see the flecks of darker gray in his eyes. I'm a grown woman, Eli Mercer. I know my own mind, and I know what I want. The town will never accept it. They'll make your life hell. Let them try. Thomas will suffer for it. Thomas adores you. He's happier now than he's been since his father died. She reached up, touched his face, felt him tremble under her hand. Stop looking for reasons to run. I'm not asking for forever. I'm asking for a chance. Can you give me that? For a long moment, Eli didn't move. Then slowly, carefully, as if he couldn't quite believe he was allowed to, he covered her hand with his own. I don't know how to be what you need. You already are, she smiled. You just don't know it yet. He kissed her then, and it was nothing like the kisses she'd shared with Garrett, not rushed or presumptuous or performative. It was careful and wondering, the kiss of a man who'd forgotten what tenderness felt like and was relearning it one moment at a time. When they pulled apart, both breathing hard, Margaret rested her forehead against his. This won't be easy, she whispered. Nothing worth having ever is. He pulled her closer. But Margaret, I need you to understand. If staying here, being with me, puts you or Thomas in danger, I'll leave. I won't let you suffer for my mistakes. Our mistakes, Eli. From now on, we face things together. That's what partners do. They stood like that for a long time, wrapped in each other and lamplight, while outside the wind howled and the first stars appeared in the vast Dakota sky. The next morning, Margaret woke with purpose. If the town was going to shun her anyway, she might as well give them something worth talking about. She dressed carefully in her best Sunday dress, pinned up her hair, and woke Thomas earlier than usual. Where are we going, Mama? He asked, rubbing sleep from his eyes. Into town. We have an announcement to make. Eli was already up, working in the barn. When Margaret told him her plan, his face went pale. Margaret, are you sure about this? Not even a little bit, but I'm tired of hiding, tired of letting other people's opinions dictate how I live my life. She straightened his collar unnecessarily, just to have an excuse to touch him. Besides, if we're going to be partners, we might as well make it official. Official? She smiled. I'm going to ask Reverend Michaels to post the banns. We'll be married in 6 weeks if you're agreeable. Eli looked like he'd been struck by lightning. Married? Margaret, we only just... I know it's fast, but I've been thinking about it all night. She took his hands. I want this, Eli. I want you, officially, legally, in a way the town can't dismiss or ignore. I want Thomas to have a father, want you to have a real home, want us to be a family. So what do you say? Will you marry me? His eyes had gone bright with emotion. You're supposed to wait for the man to ask. Well, I've never been very good at doing what I'm supposed to do. She squeezed his hands. Is that a yes? It's a yes, he said hoarsely. God help us both, it's a yes. The ride into Silver Creek felt like riding into battle. Margaret sat straight-backed on the wagon seat, Thomas between her and Eli, her chin high despite the butterflies in her stomach. As they rolled down Main Street, people stopped and stared. By the time they reached the church, a small crowd had gathered, drawn by curiosity or gossip or both. Reverend Michaels met them at the church door, his expression troubled. Mrs. Hale, Mr. Mercer, this is unexpected. Reverend, I'd like you to post the banns for our marriage, Margaret's voice carried, loud enough for the growing crowd to hear. Mr. Mercer has asked for my hand, and I've accepted. A murmur ran through the crowd like wind through wheat. The Reverend's face cycled through several expressions before settling on resigned disapproval. Mrs. Hale, perhaps we should discuss this privately. There's nothing to discuss privately. I'm a widow, he's a free man, and we're both of age. Will you post the banns or not? Margaret, think about what you're doing, Martha Yates called from the crowd. Think about your son. I am thinking about my son, Margaret called back. I'm thinking he deserves to grow up seeing that people can change, that mistakes don't define us forever, that grace and second chances are real things, not just words we say in church. You're making a mockery of this town, someone else shouted. No, Eli said quietly, but his voice carried in the sudden silence. She's showing more courage than any of you. She's choosing to believe in redemption instead of condemnation, choosing love instead of fear. He looked around at the assembled townspeople. I know what I am. I know what I did. And I know I don't deserve a woman like Margaret Hale or a boy like Thomas. But I'm going to spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of them. That's all any man can do, try to be better than he was. The crowd was silent now, every eye on them. Margaret felt Thomas's small hand slip into hers, and she squeezed it gently. Reverend Michaels sighed deeply. Very well, I'll post the bans, but I'm doing this under protest, and I want it noted that the church does not approve of this union. Noted, Margaret said crisply. Thank you, Reverend. As they walked back to the wagon, people parted before them like the Red Sea. Some faces showed disapproval. Others showed pity, but a few, just a few, showed something that might have been respect. On the ride home, Thomas was quiet until they were almost back to the farm. Then he said, Mama, does this mean Mr. Mercer is going to be my new papa? Margaret looked at Eli, saw him swallow hard before answering. If you'll have me, son. I know I can't replace your real father, but I promise I'll do my best to take care of you and your mama. Thomas considered this seriously. Will you teach me how to fix things? Like you fixed my papa's watch. Every chance I get. And will you tell me stories at bedtime? If your mama says it's all right, then I'll have you. Thomas said it with the simple certainty of childhood. You can be my papa. Eli's eyes were bright with unshed tears. He reached over and ruffled Thomas's hair, and Margaret felt her heart swell so large she thought it might burst from her chest. They spent the rest of January preparing for the wedding and for spring planting. The town's disapproval was a constant presence, but there were small kindnesses too. Old Mrs. Patterson, who ran the schoolhouse, made sure Thomas wasn't bullied anymore, and even gave Margaret some lace for her wedding dress. A few farmers who worked their own land without hired help nodded to Eli when they saw him in town, a silent acknowledgement of one working man to another. But there was also trouble. Someone trampled their winter wheat one night, destroying weeks of careful planting. Another time, they found one of their chickens dead, its neck wrung, left prominently in the middle of the yard as a message. Eli wanted to sleep in the barn with his rifle, but Margaret refused to let fear rule their lives. If they want to destroy us, they'll have to work harder than that, she said grimly. It was late February when things finally came to a head. Margaret was in town picking up supplies when she overheard Frank Sutton talking to a group of men outside the saloon. Something's got to be done, he was saying. We let one convict settle here. Next thing you know, the whole territory will be full of them. Someone needs to send Mercer a message he can't ignore. What kind of message? One of the other men asked. The kind that makes him understand he's not welcome, that men like him don't belong around decent folk. Margaret's blood went cold. She hurried back to the wagon, her mind racing. She needed to warn Eli, needed to get home before, but when she turned onto their road, she saw smoke. The barn was on fire. Margaret didn't remember unhitching the horse or running toward the flames. One moment she was frozen in the wagon seat, the next she was sprinting across the yard, her skirts hiked up, her heart hammering against her ribs. The barn Eli had rebuilt with such care was engulfed, orange flames licking at the winter sky, black smoke billowing into clouds that blotted out the pale sun. Eli! Her scream tore from her throat. Thomas! She saw her son first standing near the house with Mrs. Patterson, who must have brought him home from school. Thomas's face was streaked with tears, his small body shaking. Margaret grabbed him, held him tight. Where's Eli? Where is he? In there, Thomas sobbed, pointing at the inferno. He went in to get the horses, but they're already gone, and he hasn't come out, Mama. He hasn't come out. Margaret's world tilted. They didn't have horses anymore, hadn't had them for months, which meant Eli had gone into that burning building for nothing, for animals that weren't even there, and now he was trapped. She thrust Thomas at Mrs. Patterson. Keep him here. Don't let him follow me. Mrs. Hale, you can't. But Margaret was already running. The heat hit her like a physical wall when she reached the barn door. Flames had consumed the front entrance, but there was a side door Eli had installed, smaller and hopefully less affected. She grabbed a water bucket from the trough, doused herself, and plunged into the smoke. The world became darkness and heat and the terrible sound of wood cracking. She couldn't see, could barely breathe even with her shawl pressed over her mouth and nose. Eli! She choked on smoke. Eli, where are you? A crash somewhere to her left, then a groan that might have been structural collapse or might have been human. She moved toward it, hands outstretched, eyes streaming. Her boot hit something soft and she fell to her knees. Eli lay half buried under a fallen beam, conscious but dazed. Blood ran down his face from a gash on his forehead. When he saw her, his eyes went wide with horror. Get out! He gasped. Margaret, get out! Not without you. She grabbed the beam, tried to lift it. It wouldn't budge. Above them, the loft groaned ominously. They had seconds, maybe less. Can you move? Anything broken? Don't know. Margaret, please. She looked around frantically. There, a few feet away, the iron hook they used for baling hay. She lunged for it, hooked it under the beam, and used it as a lever with a barrel as a fulcrum, the same way she'd saved him during the storm. The beam shifted just enough. Now! Move now! Eli dragged himself out with a cry of pain just as the loft gave way entirely. Margaret threw herself over him as burning debris rained down, felt something hot strike her back, smelled her dress beginning to smolder. Then hands were grabbing them both, pulling them toward light and air. They emerged into the yard in a tangle of limbs and coughing. Margaret's lungs burned, her back screamed in pain. But Eli was alive. They were both alive, and that was all that mattered. She looked up to see who had pulled them out and found herself staring at Ben Calhoun and two of his ranch hands. Ben's face was grim, his clothes covered in soot. Saw the smoke from my place, he said shortly. Came as fast as we could. Thank you. Margaret's voice came out as a rasp. Ben, thank you. Thomas broke away from Mrs. Patterson and threw himself at his mother. Margaret held him with one arm while keeping the other on Eli, needing to touch them both, to confirm they were real and whole. More townspeople were arriving now, drawn by the smoke. They formed a bucket brigade from the well, but it was clear the barn was a total loss. All they could do was keep the fire from spreading to the house. Margaret watched flames consume months of Eli's work, watched the roof collapse inward, and felt a fury so intense it nearly choked her worse than the smoke had. Someone had done this. Someone had deliberately set fire to their barn, knowing Eli might be inside. This wasn't vandalism. This was attempted murder. The sheriff, Tom Walker, arrived as the last of the barn walls fell. He was a lean man in his 50s, with shrewd eyes and a reputation for fairness. He surveyed the scene, then walked over to where Eli sat propped against the side of the house, while Mrs. Patterson tended to the gash on his head. Anyone want to tell me what happened here? Someone set fire to our barn, Margaret said flatly. Deliberately. That's a serious accusation, Mrs. Hale. You have proof? I was in town. I heard Frank Sutton talking about sending Eli a message he couldn't ignore. Less than an hour later, our barn is burning. She met the sheriff's eyes. That enough proof for you? Walker's expression didn't change. I'll need to talk to Frank. But right now, all I've got is your word against his, in a barn that could have caught fire any number of ways. It was arson, Eli said quietly. He pointed to the remains of the barn with a trembling hand. I was inside working when I smelled kerosene. By the time I realized what was happening, the doors were blocked. Someone trapped me in there. You see who did it? No, but Mrs. Hale's right about one thing. This wasn't an accident. The sheriff nodded slowly. I'll investigate. In the meantime, you folks should think about whether you want to stay here. Seems like someone's determined to drive you off, and I can't guarantee your safety if they try again. We're not leaving, Margaret said. This is our home. Your burned home, with winter still on and no shelter for animals or equipment. Walker's tone wasn't unkind, just practical. I'm not telling you what to do, Mrs. Hale, just pointing out reality. After the sheriff left and the crowd dispersed, Margaret sat on the porch steps with Thomas while Ben's ranch hands helped Eli salvage what little they could from the barn's wreckage. Her back throbbed where the burning debris had struck her, and every breath still tasted like smoke. Ben approached slowly, as if worried she might send him away. "Margaret, I want you to know I had nothing to do with this." "I know." She looked up at him. "You saved our lives, Ben. Whatever else lies between us, I won't forget that." He sat down beside her, careful to maintain a respectful distance. "The Suttons work for me, but they don't speak for me. If they did this, and I'm not saying they did, but if they did, I'll see them brought to justice." "Will you?" Margaret's voice was bitter. "Or will you look the other way because somewhere deep down you think we deserve this? Think we brought it on ourselves for defying the town's opinion? That's not fair. Not. Isn't it?" She gestured at the smoking ruins. "Someone tried to kill Eli today, Ben. Tried to kill him for the crime of being forgiven, of getting a second chance, of daring to believe he could have a life again. And you can't tell me the good people of Silver Creek don't think that's justice." Ben was quiet for a long moment. "You're right. Some do think that. Hell, 2 months ago, I might have thought it too." He looked at her. "But watching you run into that fire for him, watching him half dead and still begging you to save yourself, that changes a man's perspective. That's not evil, Margaret. That's love. Real love. The kind that risks everything." Margaret felt tears prick her eyes for the first time since the fire started. "I can't lose him, Ben. I can't lose either of them. They're my family now." "Then fight for them. Fight for your family, and damn what anyone else thinks." He stood, put his hat back on. "If you need help rebuilding, my men and I will be here. No charge, no expectations, just neighbors helping neighbors, the way it should be." After Ben left, Margaret went to find Eli. He was standing at the edge of where the barn had been, staring at the ashes and twisted metal, his face unreadable. "We'll rebuild," she said, coming to stand beside him. "With what? We used Mrs. Pike's money to pay Hodges. We've got nothing left for materials for—" He stopped, shook his head. "Margaret, maybe the sheriff's right. Maybe you should take Thomas and go somewhere safer. I can stay, work the land, send you money." "Stop." She grabbed his face, made him look at her. "We are not separating. We are not running. We are staying right here, and we are getting married in 3 weeks like we planned. And anyone who doesn't like it can go straight to hell." A ghost of a smile touched Eli's mouth. "You kiss your son with that mouth?" "I'm about to kiss you with it, so hush." And she did, there in the ashes of their barn, with smoke still hanging in the air, and her back screaming in pain. She kissed him like a promise, like a declaration of war against everyone who wanted to tear them apart. When they pulled away, Eli rested his forehead against hers. "I don't know how to do this. How to keep you safe when the whole town wants me gone. We'll figure it out, together." She took his hand. "Come on, Mrs. Patterson will have supper ready, and we need to eat. Can't fight on an empty stomach." That night, after Thomas was asleep and Mrs. Patterson had gone home, Margaret let Eli tend to the burn on her back. She sat at the kitchen table in her chemise while he applied salve with gentle, careful fingers. "This is going to scar," he said quietly. "Good. Let it scar. Let it remind me what we survived. You could have died today. Thomas could have lost his mother because I was stupid enough to go into a burning building for horses we don't even have." Margaret turned to look at him over her shoulder. "Why did you think the horses were in there?" "I heard them screaming." His hands had stilled on her back. "At least, I thought I did. But when I got inside, there was nothing, just fire and smoke, and then the beam came down. Someone lured you in there." The realization hit her like ice water. "They made you think the animals were in danger so you'd go inside, then they blocked the doors." Eli's face had gone pale. "If you hadn't come when you did—" "But I did, and you're alive." She stood, ignoring the pain in her back, and took his face in her hands. "Listen to me, Eli Mercer. We have been through a storm, a barn collapse, a bounty hunter, and now arson. We have been threatened, shunned, and very nearly killed, and we are still standing, still together. That has to mean something. It means you're the strongest woman I've ever met. No, it means we're stronger together than apart. She kissed his forehead. Now come to bed. We have a long day tomorrow. Margaret, I can't. We're not married yet. I'm not asking you to share my bed, you stubborn man. I'm asking you to sleep in the house instead of the barn, since we don't have a barn anymore. She softened. Please. After today, I need to know you're close, that you're safe. So Eli took the spare room, Thomas's father's old room, and Margaret lay in her own bed listening to the sounds of him settling in down the hall. It should have felt strange having a man other than Garrett in the house. Instead, it felt right, like pieces of a puzzle finally clicking into place. The next morning brought the sheriff back, this time with Frank and Billy Sutton in tow. The brothers looked defiant but also nervous, their eyes darting between the sheriff and the burned barn. These two have something to say to you, Walker announced. Frank spat into the dirt. We didn't set no fire. That's not what Billy here told me when I questioned them separately, the sheriff said. Want to try again, Frank? The younger Sutton brother looked miserable. Frank said we were just going to scare him. Said we'd light a small fire in the hay, make some noise, get him running. We didn't know he'd go inside, didn't know the doors would... He stopped, realizing what he'd admitted. Margaret felt Eli tense beside her. You blocked the doors. Didn't mean for nobody to get hurt, Billy said desperately. Honest, Mrs. Hale, we just wanted to scare him off. You tried to kill him. Margaret's voice was ice. You trapped my husband. The words slipped out naturally, though they weren't married yet. You trapped him in a burning building and left him to die. Now hold on, Frank started. No, you hold on. Eli stepped forward, and both Sutton brothers instinctively stepped back. I spent 5 years in prison for taking a life, 5 years paying for one moment of violence. And you two just tried to do the same thing, tried to kill me. And you think sorry is enough? What do you want us to do? Billy's voice cracked. We said we're sorry. I want you to understand what you did, what you almost did. Eli's voice shook. That woman right there ran into a burning building to save me. She could have died. Her son could have lost his mother. For what? Because you don't like that I made a mistake and paid for it? Because I dared to try to build a life again? The brothers said nothing. Sheriff Walker cleared his throat. They're under arrest for arson and attempted murder. They'll stand trial in the spring. No, Eli said. Everyone turned to stare at him. What do you mean, no? Walker asked. I mean, I'm not pressing charges. Eli looked at the Suttons. You're going to rebuild our barn, better than it was before. You're going to work our land during spring planting, and you're going to do it for free, as payment for what you did. That's my price. Margaret started. Margaret, please. He looked at her. I spent 5 years surrounded by men who made mistakes and lost everything because of them. I know what that kind of punishment does to a person. These two are young and stupid, but they're not evil. They deserve a chance to make this right without having their lives destroyed. They tried to kill you, and I killed a man. Who am I to say they don't deserve forgiveness? He turned back to the Suttons. But understand this, you work every day until that barn is rebuilt and our crops are planted. You do exactly what Mrs. Hale or I tell you to do, and if you ever threaten my family again, I will not be so merciful. Clear? Both brothers nodded, looking shocked. Sheriff Walker shook his head. You're a better man than most, Mercer, but I'm keeping them in jail overnight anyway. Let them think about what they did. They can start making amends tomorrow. After the sheriff left with the Suttons, Margaret rounded on Eli. Have you lost your mind? They tried to murder you. I know. They could have killed both of us. They could have made Thomas an orphan. I know, Margaret. He took her hands. But what good does revenge do? Lock them up, ruin their lives. Does that unburn the barn? Does that make us safer? It might. Or it might make their friends and family angrier. Might escalate this into something worse. He squeezed her hands. This way, they have to face what they did every single day. Have to work beside the man they tried to kill. Have to see you and Thomas, and remember what they almost destroyed. That's a harder punishment than jail, trust me. Margaret wanted to argue, but she could see the logic. More than that, she could see the man Eli was trying to be. Not someone ruled by anger or revenge, but someone who'd learned the hard way that violence and punishment didn't heal wounds, they just made new ones. "You're either incredibly wise or incredibly foolish," she finally said. "Probably both." He managed a small smile. "But it's what feels right." The Sutton brothers showed up at dawn the next morning, looking hungover and ashamed. Eli put them to work immediately, and to their credit, they didn't complain. Frank was sullen and silent, but Billy tried to make conversation, tried to explain. "We really didn't mean to—" "I don't care what you meant," Eli cut him off. "I care what you do. So do the work, and keep your mouth shut." Over the following days, a strange thing happened. Other men from town started showing up. Ben Calhoun brought lumber from his own stockpile. Old Mr. Patterson, the schoolteacher's husband, brought tools. Even Reverend Michaels appeared one afternoon with his sleeves rolled up, ready to work. "I may not approve of everything happening here," the Reverend said stiffly, "but I do believe in Christian charity. And it's not Christian to let a family suffer, regardless of their choices." Margaret watched from the porch as the barn began to rise again, better and stronger than before. She watched Eli work alongside the men who'd condemned him, watched him earn their grudging respect through steady labor and quiet competence. And she watched the Sutton brothers slowly transform from hostile antagonists into something approaching allies. It was Billy who finally broke the ice. 2 weeks into the work, he was helping Eli frame out the loft when he suddenly said, "My pa was a drunk, beat my ma near to death twice before he finally killed himself. Walked into the river one winter and didn't come back out." Eli didn't stop working, just kept nailing boards. "I'm sorry. Point is, I understand what it's like to have a past that follows you. Ma never could shake the shame of it. Town always looked at her like she was tainted somehow, like his sickness was her fault." Billy hammered in a nail with more force than necessary. "Guess that's why it was easy to think you were dangerous, easier to believe you were still a killer than to think you might have changed." "Maybe I am still a killer. Maybe that's something that never goes away, just gets buried deeper." Eli set down his hammer, looked at the younger man. "But I'm trying to be more than that, trying to be someone my family can be proud of. That's all any of us can do. Try to be better than our worst day." Billy nodded slowly. "Reckon that's true enough." He paused. "For what it's worth, I'm glad Mrs. Hale shot my gun hand instead of somewhere worse. She's got good aim." Despite everything, Eli laughed. "She does at that." The barn was finished 3 days before the wedding. It stood strong and square, with proper ventilation and reinforced beams and a loft that could hold twice as much hay as the old one. The men gathered around it at sunset on that final day, admiring their work with the quiet satisfaction of a job well done. Frank Sutton approached Eli awkwardly, his hat in his hands. "It's finished." "So it is. Good work." "Look, Frank struggled with the words. "What we did was wrong. More than wrong. And you giving us a chance to make it right instead of seeing us locked up. I don't understand why you did that, but I won't forget it." "Just don't do it again." Eli extended his hand. "To anyone. Deal?" Frank stared at the offered hand for a long moment, then shook it. "Deal." After the men left, Eli stood alone in the new barn, running his hands over the smooth wood, breathing in the scent of fresh sawdust and new beginnings. He thought about Jonas Pike, about 5 years in prison, about Miguel making it home to Mexico. He thought about Margaret running into a fire for him, about Thomas calling him Papa, about a town slowly, grudgingly, learning that redemption was possible. He thought about the man he'd been and the man he was becoming. And for the first time in 7 years, he felt something uncurl in his chest, something that might have been hope or forgiveness, or just the simple understanding that his worst moment didn't have to be his only moment. "Eli?" Margaret's voice came from the doorway. "You coming in for supper?" He turned to see her silhouetted against the last light of day, Thomas's small hand in hers, both of them waiting for him. His family. His home. "Yeah," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Yeah. I'm coming." 3 days later, Margaret Hale married Eli Mercer in the Silver Creek Church with half the town in attendance. She wore her grandmother's lace and carried wildflowers Thomas had picked that morning. Eli wore his only suit, borrowed from Ben Calhoun, and when he said his vows, his voice shook but never wavered. Reverend Michaels performed the ceremony with professional dignity, though his disapproval was clear in every word. But when it came time for the kiss, when Eli cupped Margaret's face with work-roughened hands and kissed her with everything he had, all his gratitude and hope and desperate love, something shifted in the church. People who'd come to judge stayed to witness. And in witnessing, they saw something they hadn't expected. Not a convict and a foolish widow, but two people who'd chosen each other against all reason and were somehow better for it. At the reception in the church hall, Thomas stood on a chair and announced to everyone that he had the best new papa in the whole territory. The Sutton brothers, who'd been invited against Margaret's better judgment, actually smiled. Ben Calhoun toasted the couple with genuine warmth, and Martha Yates, who'd sworn she'd never accept this union, was seen dabbing at her eyes with her handkerchief. As the sun set and the celebration continued, Margaret and Eli slipped outside for a moment alone. They stood on the church steps, her hand in his, looking out at the prairie that stretched endlessly in all directions. "We did it," she said softly. "We actually did it." "We did." Eli squeezed her hand. "Though I'm still not convinced you haven't lost your mind marrying me." "Probably have, but it's too late now. You're stuck with me." She looked up at him. "No regrets?" "Not a single one." He kissed her forehead. "You saved my life, Margaret Mercer, in more ways than one." "We saved each other," she corrected. "That's what partners do." From inside the hall came the sound of laughter and music, of a community slowly healing, slowly learning that grace was messier and harder and more necessary than judgment. But out here, under the vast Dakota sky, it was just the two of them and the future they'd chosen together. A future that wouldn't be easy, Margaret knew. There would still be people who whispered, still be those who'd never forgive or forget. There would be hard seasons and lean times, setbacks and struggles. But they'd face all of it together, this reformed killer and the widow who'd loved him anyway. And somehow, that would be enough. Spring came to the Dakota Territory like a promise kept. The snow melted into black earth, the prairie grass turned green almost overnight, and the wheat they'd planted in those desperate winter days began to push through the soil in neat, hopeful rows. Margaret stood at the kitchen window watching Eli and Thomas work in the field, their figures small against the vast sky, and felt something close to contentment settle over her like morning light. They'd been married 3 weeks now, and the adjustment had been easier than she'd expected. Eli moved through the house quietly, always asking permission, always making space for her routines and Thomas's needs. At night, he held her like she was something precious and breakable, and she'd learned that beneath his careful reserve was a man capable of profound tenderness. The scars on his wrists had faded to white lines, but the scars inside took longer to heal. She was patient. They both were. They had time now. The knock at the door startled her from her thoughts. When she opened it, she found Sheriff Walker standing on the porch, his hat in his hands and his expression troubled. "Mrs. Mercer, is your husband around?" The name still gave her a small thrill. Mrs. Mercer. Mrs. Eli Mercer. A new identity for a new life. "He's in the south field with Thomas. Is something wrong?" "I need to speak with him. Official business." Walker's tone was careful, neutral in the way lawmen got when they were trying not to show their hand. Margaret's stomach tightened. "What kind of business?" "The kind best discussed with him present. Would you mind fetching him?" She wanted to demand answers, but the sheriff's face told her she'd get nothing until Eli was there. She walked out to the field, her heart beating faster with each step. They'd had 3 weeks of peace, 3 weeks of building their life together without interference or threat. It had been too easy, too good. She should have known it couldn't last. Eli saw her coming and straightened, immediately reading the tension in her shoulders. "What's wrong?" "Sheriff's here, says he needs to talk to you." The color drained from Eli's face. "About what?" He wouldn't say. She grabbed his hand. "Eli, what could this be about? You've served your sentence. There's no outstanding warrants." "I know. I don't know what this is." But his hand trembled in hers, and she knew he was thinking the same thing she was, that the past was never really past, that men like him never really got to start over, that 3 weeks of happiness was all they'd ever be allowed. Thomas looked between them, his young face worried. "Is Mr. Walker going to take Papa away?" No, Margaret said firmly, though her heart was screaming the opposite. Everything's fine, sweetheart. Why don't you go check on the chickens while Papa and I talk to the sheriff? Back at the house, Walker was waiting by the porch, and Margaret's breath caught when she saw he wasn't alone. A woman stood beside him, maybe 40, wearing a travel-worn dress and carrying a carpet bag. Her face was gaunt, but there was strength in it, and something about her eyes was familiar. "Mr. Mercer," Walker said as they approached, "this is Mrs. Sarah Pike. She's come a long way to speak with you." Eli stopped dead. Margaret felt him go rigid beside her, felt all the air leave his lungs in one terrible rush. Jonas Pike's widow. The woman who'd sent the letter, the money, the forgiveness. She'd come here. Why would she come here? "Mrs. Pike," Eli's voice was barely audible. I'm not sure what to say." Sarah Pike studied him with eyes that had seen too much grief. "You're younger than I expected, though I suppose you were even younger when it happened." She glanced at Margaret. "You must be his wife, the one who believed in him when no one else would." "I'm Margaret Mercer." She moved closer to Eli, a silent declaration of solidarity. "And yes, I believe in my husband." "Good. He'll need that." Sarah set down her carpet bag. "Mr. Mercer, I didn't come here to cause you trouble. I came because there's something you need to know, something that changes everything." "I don't understand," Eli said. Sarah reached into her bag and pulled out a thick envelope. "After Jonas died, I hired Mr. Hardesty to find out what really happened. He found the truth that Jonas was the villain, not you, but he found something else too, something Jonas had been hiding from me for years." She opened the envelope and spread papers across the porch railing. Legal documents, yellowed with age, covered in official stamps and signatures. "My husband's real name wasn't Jonas Pike. It was Jonas Thaddeus Cartwright. He was wanted in 3 states for fraud, theft, and assault. He'd been running from the law for 15 years when he met me, and I never knew." Her voice was steady but edged with old pain. "The man I married, the father of my children, was a criminal who'd left a trail of victims across half the country." Margaret felt Eli sway slightly beside her. She grabbed his arm, steadied him. "Why are you telling me this?" Eli asked. "Because Jonas had money, a lot of it, hidden away from his various schemes. Money that legally belongs to his victims, but since most of them are dead or can't be found, it defaults to his estate." Sarah looked directly at Eli. "You saved a boy's life that night. You stopped Jonas from committing murder, and you paid for it with 5 years of your life while Jonas's real crimes went unpunished. That doesn't sit right with me, Mr. Mercer." She pulled out another document, this one newer, the ink still fresh. "This is a settlement agreement. I've worked with a lawyer in Chicago to set aside a portion of Jonas's hidden funds as restitution to you. It's not enough, nothing could be enough, but it's something, $2,500. The number hung in the air like something from a dream. Margaret couldn't breathe. That was more money than most people saw in a lifetime. That was enough to pay off the farm, buy equipment, secure their future for years to come. "I can't take this," Eli said, but his voice lacked conviction. "You can, and you will." Sarah's tone brooked no argument. "My children and I are provided for. Jonas had insurance, and I've sold our house back east. This money, it's dirty money, Mr. Mercer. Money stolen and hoarded by a man who destroyed lives. Let it do some good for once. Let it help the man who tried to stop him." "Mrs. Pike, I killed your husband." "You stopped a monster who happened to be wearing my husband's face." Sarah's eyes were bright with unshed tears. "The man I married died long before that night in the barn. Whatever came after was just a shell walking around, doing damage. You put an end to that. In a strange way, you set me free too." Sheriff Walker cleared his throat. "The money's legal, Mercer. I've checked. Mrs. Pike has every right to distribute her husband's estate as she sees fit. You'd be a fool not to take it." Eli looked at Margaret, his eyes desperate and confused and full of something that might have been hope. She squeezed his hand. "Take it," she whispered. "Let it be over. Let the past finally, truly be over." So Eli signed the papers with shaking hands, and Sarah Pike pressed the bank draft into his palm. And just like that, everything changed. The weight that had been crushing him for 7 years lifted, not completely, but enough that he could stand straighter, breathe deeper, believe more fully in the possibility of redemption. After Sarah and the sheriff left, Eli and Margaret sat on the porch steps in stunned silence. The bank draft lay on Eli's knee, a small piece of paper that represented freedom, security, a future they'd barely dared to imagine. $2,500, Margaret finally said. That's more than this farm is worth. More than we'd make in 5 good years. It doesn't feel real. Eli picked up the draft, studied it as if expecting it to disappear. This morning I was worried about whether we'd have enough seed for the full 40 acres. Now we can pay off every debt, buy proper equipment, hire help for harvest, maybe even add on to the house. Margaret's voice rose with excitement. Eli, do you understand what this means? We're free. Really, truly free. But Eli's expression was complicated. Is it right, though? Taking money that came from criminal acts? From people Jonas hurt? Sarah said the victims are dead or can't be found. She said it was dirty money that needed to do some good. Margaret took his face in her hands. You've spent 7 years punishing yourself. You've been shot at, nearly burned alive, shunned by an entire town. You've worked yourself to exhaustion trying to prove you're worthy of a second chance. Don't you think you've earned this? Don't you think you deserve to stop suffering? I don't know what I deserve anymore, Eli admitted. Some days I wake up next to you and think I'm dreaming, that this life is too good for someone like me. Someone like you. Margaret's voice went fierce. You mean someone who risks his life to save others? Someone who forgives the men who tried to kill him? Someone who teaches my son to be honest and kind and hardworking? She kissed him hard. You deserve every good thing, Eli Mercer, and I'll spend the rest of my life making sure you believe it. They sat there as the sun climbed higher, planning their future in whispers and dreams. They'd pay off Hodges first, wipe away that debt that had haunted Margaret for so long. Then the bank, clear the mortgage entirely. They'd buy chickens and pigs, maybe even a milk cow. They'd hire the Sutton brothers for harvest, pay them fairly, turn enemies into employees. They'd donate to the school, help Mrs. Patterson get the new book she'd been wanting. They'd be not just participants in Silver Creek, but pillars of it, impossible to ignore or dismiss. Thomas came running from the chicken coop, his small face flushed with excitement. Mama, Papa, one of the hens laid 2 eggs in the same nest. Is that good luck? Eli scooped the boy up, swung him around until Thomas squealed with laughter. The best luck, son. The very best. Margaret watched them together and felt her throat tighten with emotion. This was what she'd been fighting for. Not just survival, not just clearing Eli's name, but this. Ordinary moments of joy, a child's laughter, a man who'd forgotten how to be happy learning to smile again. The next few weeks passed in a blur of activity. Eli went to the bank in the neighboring town, unwilling to trust the money to the Silver Creek Bank, where too many people might ask questions. He came back with a receipt showing the mortgage paid in full and the rest deposited in an account under both their names. Margaret paid off Hodges, and the look on the merchant's face when she handed over cash instead of promises was worth every bit of struggle they'd endured. Word spread quickly, as it always did in small towns. People whispered about where the money had come from, invented stories about hidden gold or criminal enterprises. But the whispers were different now, tinged with grudging respect instead of pure condemnation. The Mercers had money. They'd made it somehow, against all odds, and in the territory that counted for something. Ben Calhoun came by one evening, ostensibly to borrow a tool, but really to satisfy his curiosity. Margaret invited him in for coffee, and the 3 of them sat around the kitchen table that had witnessed so many crucial moments. I hear you've come into some funds, Ben said carefully. We have. Eli didn't elaborate, and Margaret hid a smile. Let the town wonder. Good. You've earned it, whatever way it came. Ben sipped his coffee. I also heard you're planning to hire help for harvest. The Suttons are good workers when they put their minds to it. Glad to see you're giving them steady employment. They're making amends, Eli said. Seemed only fair to let them finish what they started. Ben nodded slowly. You're a better man than most, Mercer. Better than me, certainly. He looked at Margaret. I was wrong about you two. I thought, hell, I don't know what I thought, that you were making a mistake, throwing your life away on someone who couldn't change. But I was the one who couldn't change. couldn't see past my own prejudices. Takes courage to admit that, Margaret said gently. Takes courage to do what you did. Ben stood, preparing to leave. For what it's worth, you have my respect. Both of you. And if you ever need anything, truly need it, my door's open. After he left, Eli pulled Margaret into his arms. Did that just happen? Did Ben Calhoun just apologize to us? Miracles never cease. She rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. We're really going to be all right, aren't we? More than all right. His voice was full of wonder. We're going to thrive. The summer proved him right. The wheat grew tall and golden, the garden produced more vegetables than they could eat, and the chickens and pigs they bought thrived under Thomas's devoted care. The Sutton brothers showed up every day without fail, working hard and keeping their mouths shut, and by harvest time they'd become something approaching friends. It was during harvest that everything finally came full circle. They were working in the fields, Eli and the Suttons cutting wheat, Margaret and Thomas following behind to gather and bundle, when a rider appeared on the horizon. As he drew closer, Margaret's heart began to pound. She recognized that horse, that posture, that way of riding. It was Cole Hardesty, the bounty hunter who'd brought Sarah Pike's letter months ago. Eli saw him too and straightened, wiping sweat from his brow. Mr. Hardesty, wasn't expecting to see you again. Hardesty dismounted, and Margaret noticed he looked older, more tired than before. Mr. Mercer. Mrs. Mercer. I hope I'm not interrupting. Just bringing in the harvest, Eli said carefully. What brings you back to Silver Creek? News from Mexico. Thought you'd want to hear it in person. Hardesty pulled a letter from his saddlebag. Remember that boy? Miguel? The one you saved? Eli's hand stilled on the wheat stalks. Of course. I think about him often. He wrote you a letter, sent it to Mrs. Pike since he didn't know how to reach you, and she forwarded it to me. Hardesty handed over the envelope. He wanted you to know what became of him. With shaking hands, Eli opened the letter. Margaret moved to his side, reading over his shoulder. The handwriting was careful, the English imperfect but clear. Dear Mr. Mercer, I do not know if this letter finds you. I do not know if you remember the boy you saved 7 years ago. But I remember you every day. I remember your courage, your sacrifice. Because of you, I lived. Because of you, I got to hold my mother again, to meet my 3 younger sisters, to become a teacher in my village. I teach children now, Mr. Mercer. I teach them to read and write, teach them mathematics and history. I teach them that one person's courage can change everything. I tell them about the man who risked his life so a boy he barely knew could go home. I know you went to prison. Mr. Hardesty told me when he found me. I know you paid a terrible price for saving my life. I wish I could have spoken at your trial, could have told them what really happened, but I was young and scared and far away, and by the time I learned what became of you, it was too late. This letter comes to say thank you. Thank you for my life. Thank you for every sunrise I have seen, every child I have taught, every moment of joy I have experienced. All of it exists because you chose to act when others would not. I have saved money. Not much, but what I can. I am sending it to you as payment for the debt I owe. It is not enough, nothing could be, but please accept it as a token of my gratitude and my respect. You are a hero, Mr. Mercer. I hope you know that. I hope you have found peace and happiness. You deserve nothing less. With deepest respect and eternal gratitude, Miguel Alejandro Torres. Enclosed in the envelope was another bank draft. Not as large as Sarah Pike's, but substantial. $200, probably everything Miguel had managed to save working as a village teacher. Eli stood frozen, the letter trembling in his hands, tears streaming openly down his face. Margaret wrapped her arms around him as his shoulders shook with 7 years of pent-up grief and guilt and relief. He's alive, Eli choked out. He's teaching children. He's happy. Because of you, Margaret whispered. That boy is alive and thriving because you refused to stand by and let evil happen. Frank Sutton, who'd stopped working to watch, spoke up quietly. That's 27 kids, maybe 30, who've learned to read because you saved their teacher. Multiply that over a lifetime. All the people those kids will teach or help or influence. He shook his head. That's a hell of a legacy, Mercer. Better than most men leave behind. Eli wiped his eyes roughly. I need a moment. He walked away from the field toward the line of cottonwoods by the creek, and Margaret let him go. Some moments a man needed to face alone, needed to reconcile with his past in private. She watched him disappear into the shade, then turned to find Hardesty still standing there. Thank you for bringing this, she said. You didn't have to track us down personally. Felt right to close the circle. Hardesty glanced toward where Eli had gone. I've tracked a lot of men in my time, Mrs. Mercer. Most of them are running from what they did, making excuses, blaming everyone but themselves. Your husband's different. He owned his mistake, paid his debt, and spent every day since trying to build something good. That's rare. Precious rare. He's a good man who did a terrible thing in an impossible situation, Margaret said. I'm glad the world is finally seeing that. After Hardesty left, Margaret found Eli sitting by the creek, the letter spread on his knee. She sat beside him in the grass, not speaking, just present. Thomas appeared a few minutes later and climbed wordlessly into his father's lap. The three of them sat like that as the sun arced across the sky, as the wheat rustled in the breeze, as the past and present and future wove together into something whole. I don't know what to do with this, Eli finally said, touching Miguel's bank draft. It's everything he has. I can't take it. Then send it back with instructions to use it for his school, Margaret suggested. Buy books, supplies, whatever they need. Let it do good where it's needed most. Eli nodded slowly. Yes, that's right. He looked down at Thomas. What do you think, son? Should we help Miguel's school? Will there be kids there like me, learning their letters and numbers? Exactly like you. Then we should help them. Papa always says we should help people when we can. Eli's arms tightened around the boy. When did you get so wise? I'm almost 8 now, very grown up. Thomas said it with such seriousness that both adults smiled despite the emotion of the moment. That evening, as they sat around the dinner table, the Sutton brothers included, since they'd fallen into the habit of staying for meals, Eli made an announcement. I've been thinking about something, about how to honor what happened, what we've all been through, and I've decided I want to do something meaningful with the money we've received. Margaret set down her fork. What did you have in mind? I want to donate to the school, enough to add a new room, buy proper books, maybe hire a second teacher, and I want to establish a fund, something for families who are struggling, who need a hand up rather than handouts. Call it the Second Chances Fund. He looked around the table. We all got second chances here. Miguel got one. The Suttons got one. I got one. Seems only right to pass that along. Frank Sutton cleared his throat roughly. That's real decent of you, Mercer. More than decent. It's the right thing, Eli said simply. Money doesn't mean anything if it's just sitting in a bank. But if it can help someone avoid the mistakes I made or recover from mistakes they've already made, that means something. Margaret reached across the table and took his hand. In that moment, she loved him more than she'd thought possible. This man who'd been broken and rebuilt, who'd learned that redemption wasn't a destination but a daily choice, who understood that grace received must be grace given. He was extraordinary, and she got to spend the rest of her life with him. The announcement of the Second Chances Fund transformed Silver Creek's attitude toward the Mercers completely. When Eli and Margaret appeared at the town meeting to formally present their donation, the room full of people who'd once shunned them rose in spontaneous applause. Reverend Michaels, tears in his eyes, apologized publicly for his judgment and asked if he could help administer the fund. I was wrong about you, Mr. Mercer, the Reverend said. I saw a convict where I should have seen a man of God. I saw danger where I should have seen courage. Please forgive me. Already forgiven, Reverend, Eli said. We've all got things to atone for. Might as well do it together. The first recipient of the Second Chances Fund was a young widow named Ellen Morrison, whose husband had died in a mining accident, leaving her with 3 children and mounting debts. The fund paid off her debts and provided seed money for a dressmaking business she'd been dreaming of starting. Within a year, she was employing 2 other women and teaching sewing classes at the expanded school. The second recipient was Billy Sutton, who used a small loan from the fund to buy tools and start a carpentry business. His first major project was building a new church bell tower, which he did at cost as thanks to the community that had given him another chance. The third recipient was Ben Calhoun, though not in the way anyone expected. Ben didn't need money, but he did need help finding purpose after years of solitary farming. Eli hired him as a partner in expanding the Mercer farm, and together they developed new irrigation techniques that transformed how crops were grown in the territory. As autumn turned to winter and then to spring again, the Mercer farm became a kind of center for the community. People came seeking advice, assistance, or just conversation with the couple who'd proven that second chances weren't just possible but transformative. Margaret taught reading to women who'd never learned, while Eli mentored young men in farming techniques and, more importantly, in the art of honorable living. Thomas grew tall and confident, secure in the love of two parents and a community that had learned to value redemption over judgment. He excelled at school, helped around the farm with increasing competence, and developed his father's quiet strength and his mother's fierce determination. It was a spring morning 2 years after their wedding when Eli found Margaret standing in the field where the barn had burned, now planted with wildflowers she'd seeded the previous fall. She held something in her hands, and as he approached, he saw it was the old prison workshop nameplate he'd once shown her. "I thought you'd thrown that away," he said, coming to stand beside her. "I almost did. But then I thought, this is part of your story. Part of our story." She traced the worn letters of his name. "It's a reminder of where you came from and how far you've traveled. That's not something to be ashamed of." "I'm not ashamed anymore," Eli said, and he realized as he said it that it was true. "Not of this, anyway. It's just a piece of wood with my name on it. The man who made it, he's not me anymore." "No, he's not, Margaret smiled. "He's better, stronger, more himself than he ever could have been without the journey." They stood together in the field of flowers, this man who'd been condemned and this woman who'd chosen to believe in him anyway, and watched Thomas playing with the farm dog in the distance. The barn stood solid behind them, rebuilt and stronger than before. The wheat grew in neat rows, promising another good harvest. The future stretched ahead like the prairie itself, vast, uncertain, full of possibility. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't answered my advertisement?" Margaret asked. "Every day. And every day I thank God I was brave enough to take the chance." Eli pulled her close. "You saved me, Margaret. Not just from the fire, but from myself. From believing I was beyond redemption." "We saved each other," she corrected. "You showed me what real courage looks like, what it means to stand up for what's right even when the cost is devastating, what it means to keep trying even when everyone's given up on you. I never gave up because of you, because you saw something in me I'd forgotten was there." Margaret turned to face him fully, this man who'd become her partner, her love, her home. "Want to know a secret?" "Always." "I knew from the moment you stepped off that stagecoach. Knew you were different, special, worth the risk." She smiled at his surprised expression. "Your eyes, they were honest even when everything else about the situation was complicated. I've always trusted honest eyes." "And now? Do you still trust these eyes?" "With my life, with Thomas's life, with everything I have." She kissed him softly. "You're stuck with me, Eli Mercer. For better or worse, richer or poorer, until death do us part." "Best fate I could have asked for," he murmured against her lips. Thomas came running up, the dog barking joyfully at his heels. "Mama! Papa! Look what I found!" He held up an arrowhead, ancient and perfect. "It was just sitting there in the dirt by the creek. Do you think it's valuable?" "More valuable than gold," Eli said, crouching down to examine the artifact with proper seriousness. "That's history right there in your hand. Someone made that, used that, maybe 100 years ago. Maybe more. Can I keep it?" "Of course. But you have to take care of it. Remember where it came from. It's a piece of this land's story." "Just like you're part of our family's story," Thomas said with the unconscious wisdom of children. "You and Mama and me. We're all part of the same story now." Eli's eyes met Margaret's over their son's head, and in that look was everything they'd survived, and everything they'd built, and everything still to come. The past would always be there, the mistakes and the pain and the long road to redemption, but it didn't define them anymore. They'd taken something broken and made it beautiful, had chosen love over fear and grace over judgment. That night, after Thomas was asleep and the chores were done, Eli and Margaret sat on their porch watching the stars emerge one by one over the Dakota sky. The air smelled of growing things and possibility. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called and another answered. "I wrote to Miguel today," Eli said. "Sent the money for his school along with a letter. Told him about us, about Thomas, about this life we've built." "What did you tell him?" "That I finally understand what he meant in his letter. About legacy, about ripples spreading outward. That the boy he was became the teacher he is because I made one good choice in the middle of a terrible situation. And that choice led to all of this. You, Thomas, this farm, this community. One good choice and everything changed." "One good choice," Margaret repeated softly. "Maybe that's all any of us can do. Make one good choice, then another, until we've built a life worth living." "A life worth living," Eli echoed. He pulled her closer, and she rested her head on his shoulder. "That's exactly what this is. What you are. Everything worth living for." They sat like that until the stars filled the sky like promises, until the coyotes fell silent and the prairie settled into darkness. Inside the house behind them, Thomas slept peacefully, his arrowhead on the nightstand beside his father's repaired pocket watch. In the barn, the animals were safe and warm. In the fields, the wheat grew steadily toward harvest. And in this moment, on this porch, two people who'd found each other against all odds held tight to what they'd built together. The town of Silver Creek would remember them for generations, not as the convict and the foolish widow, but as the couple who'd proven that redemption was real, that love could overcome judgment, that second chances weren't just possible but necessary for a community to thrive. Their story would be told and retold, embellished and simplified, but at its core would always be this truth: that a man's past doesn't have to be his prison, that grace is stronger than condemnation, and that sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is believe in someone when no one else will. Years later, when Thomas Mercer brought his own wife to the farm, when he showed her the arrowhead and told her the story of how his mother had saved his father, and his father had saved a boy, and that boy had saved countless others, she would ask if it was all true. "Every word," Thomas would say. "My parents taught me that people can change, that mistakes don't define us, that the only thing that matters is what we do with the life we're given. My father spent 5 years in prison for saving someone's life. My mother risked everything to give him a second chance, and together they built something beautiful out of something broken." But that was all still to come. For now there was just this night, these stars, this man and this woman, and the child sleeping safely inside. There was just the prairie wind and the smell of wheat and the certain knowledge that whatever came next, they would face it together. Eli stood, offered his hand to Margaret. "Come to bed, Mrs. Mercer. We've got an early start tomorrow." "We do," she agreed, taking his hand and letting him pull her to her feet. "But then we always do. That's the nature of farming, of living, of loving. You show up every day and do the work." "And the work is good," Eli said. "The work is good," Margaret echoed. They walked inside together, closing the door on the night and on the past and on everything that had tried to break them. In the morning, they would wake with the sun and begin again, planting, building, loving, living, making choice after choice that added up to a life of meaning and purpose and grace. But for tonight, it was enough to lie in each other's arms and know that they had made it. They had survived the judgment and the fire and the weight of the past. They had built a family, a farm, a future. They had proven that a man's heart could speak louder than his history, that redemption was possible, and that love, real, stubborn, determined love, could transform everything. Outside, the stars wheeled slowly across the Dakota sky. In the barn, the horses shifted in their sleep. In the fields, the wheat grew silently toward harvest. And in the house on the edge of Silver Creek, a family slept peacefully, secure in the knowledge that tomorrow would bring another chance to choose grace over judgment, love over fear, hope over despair. The mail-order husband who'd been rejected for his past had found his home at last. Not just a place to live, but a place to belong. Not just forgiveness, but acceptance. Not just survival, but joy. And his heart, which had never lied even when everything else about him was questioned, beat steady and true through the night, keeping time with the woman who'd believed in it when no one else would. That was redemption. That was grace. That was love. And it was enough.